My name is Jack, and I took this job because my life had been stripped down to the studs. The office where I finalized the deal was a single, wide trailer baking in the South Florida sun, its aluminum siding peeling like a bad sunburn. The air inside was thick, smelling of stale cigarette smoke, mildew, and the quiet desperation that hangs around places that deal exclusively in cash. Outside, the endless expanse of the Everglades shimmered in the heat, a flat, green line that promised nothing but more heat and humidity. I was a long way from the crisp mountain air I was used to, a refugee from a life that had collapsed under the weight of bad decisions and worse luck. The man behind the desk, a sweaty fellow named Rick, counted out my advance with thick, stained fingers. He didn't ask for a resume or references. The only qualification seemed to be a willingness to disappear for a few days and not ask too many questions. The job came from a tattered flyer I'd found pinned to a gas station bulletin board, promising hard work. Good pay for a deckhand on a fishing boat. It was the kind of ad you either ignore or answer when you have no other choice. I was firmly in the latter category. This cash-only arrangement felt like it belonged to a bygone era of poachers and rum runners, men who used the swamp's vast, untraceable wilderness to hide their dealings. I wasn't a criminal, but I was running from the ghosts of debt, and this felt like a place where ghosts could get lost. Rick gave me a curt nod. Captain's name is Silas. He'll be waiting for you at the docks off the Tamiami. Don't be late. The docks were less a marina and more a collection of weathered planks clinging to the edge of a murky canal. A handful of boats were tied up, mostly specialized vessels designed for these unique waters. There were flat-bottomed John boats and a few sleek flats boats, built low to the water for navigating the shallow grassy plains that give the Everglades its nickname, the River of Grass. And then there was my ride. She was named the Cypress Witch, the letters painted in faded black on her stern. She wasn't a tourist's airboat, built for thrills and speed, but a workhorse. She looked like a heavily modified center console boat, maybe 25 feet long, with a shallow draft designed to slip through the narrow vegetation, choked waterways where other boats would ground out. Her hull was a roadmap of scars and deep gouges, testament to countless encounters with submerged logs, Worcester bars, or worse. This was not a vessel for recreation, it was a tool, honed and hardened by its environment. A man stood on the deck, coiling a rope with an economy of motion that spoke of a lifetime at sea. This had to be Silas. He was as weathered as his boat, his skin the texture of tanned leather, his eyes a pale, washed out blue that seemed to look right through me. He wasn't the jolly, bearded sailor of postcards. There was a hollowness to him, a profound stillness that was more unsettling than any loud aggression. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out by a long, grim duty, a survivor from one of the many tragedies that the Everglades are known for swallowing whole, from lost planes to murdered men. "You Jack?" he asked, his voice a low rasp, like sand on stone. I nodded. "That's me. Get your gear. We leave at dusk." He didn't offer a handshake. As I stowed my small duffel bag, I noticed strange markings carved into the wooden frame of the cabin door and the window casings. They weren't nautical knots or decorative flourishes. They were geometric patterns. A 5-pointed star here. A complex mesh like grid there. They looked like something ancient, symbols of protection you might find scratched into the walls of an old church to ward off evil. On a fishing boat in the middle of Florida, they were deeply out of place. The boat wasn't just a tool, it was a fortress. As the sun began to bleed across the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and purples, Silas called me over. He didn't give me a safety briefing about life vests or fire extinguishers. Instead, he handed me a grimy, laminated card, its edges softened with wear. "The rules," he said, his tone devoid of any irony. It was the same dead, serious gravity a pilot might use before takeoff. I took the card. My grandfather was a fisherman, a man steeped in the superstitions of the sea, and I figured this was just more of the same. Quirks and traditions to appease the fickle gods of the water. I suppressed a cynical smile and read the list. 1. No bananas on board, not even in a trail mix. Don't test this. 2. The right foot steps on board first. The left foot steps off first. Always. 3. Never whistle after sunset. It calls the wind and what rides it. 4. If you hear an owl, you don't. Look at your feet until the sound is gone. 5. We only keep the mangrove snapper. Everything else goes back, no matter the size or value. 6. A portion of the first snapper's heart is returned to the water. An offering. All fish bones and guts are burned in the brazier. Nothing organic goes overboard. 8. Never speak the name Stygiani, not even to ask what it means. 9. If the water glows with a red light, cut the lines and do not look at your reflection. 10. Do not bring any light source into the cabin between midnight and 3 a.m. I read the list twice. It was a bizarre cocktail of common maritime folklore and deeply specific, unsettling commands. No bananas, a classic sailor's tale. But Rule Fe 4 and Rule 98 felt different. They felt personal, rooted in a fear that was anything but generic. I wanted to ask, to press him on what a Stygiani was, but the finality in his eyes stopped me. He wasn't sharing eccentricities, he was giving orders. "Got it?" he asked. "Got it," I lied, tucking the card into my pocket. Silas grunted, satisfied. He started the engine. A low rumble that settled into a steady thrum, and we pulled away from the dock, heading into the heart of the swamp. The transition from the world of men to the world of the Everglades was absolute. As we moved deeper into the labyrinthine waterways, the last vestiges of civilization, the distant glow of Miami, the rumble of traffic on the highway, vanished. We were swallowed by the night. At first, it was beautiful in a way that made you feel small and insignificant. The sky was a revelation. With no light pollution, the natural lightscape, as the Park Service calls it, was overwhelming. The Milky Way wasn't a faint dusting of stars. It was a thick, luminous band. A celestial river of light painted across a canvas of perfect black. So clear you could see the dark clouds of interstellar dust blocking the stars beyond. The moon was a silver dollar, its light reflecting off the still, black water, making it look like a sheet of polished obsidian. But the beauty was a mask. As my eyes adjusted, the awe was slowly replaced by a primal unease. The world was not silent. It was a deafening symphony of life. A high, pitched, incessant drone of mosquitoes formed the baseline, a constant reminder of the billion tiny, hungry things that owned this place. Beneath that was the chugging, croaking chorus of countless frogs, a rhythmic, almost intelligent sound that seemed to mock our intrusion. Every few minutes, a loud splash from the darkness would make me jump. A fish, a bird, something larger. I felt a profound sense of isolation, a feeling that if something went wrong out here, no one would ever find us. This vast wetland had a history of making things disappear. Silas cut the engine in a wide, shallow bay, the water thick with sawgrass. The silence that followed the engine's death was somehow louder than the noise. "We start here," he said, handing me a rod. As I baited my hook, I scanned the darkness, and that's when I saw them. Pairs of tiny, glowing embers just above the water's surface. Dozens of them. They were all around us, watching, waiting. Alligator eyes, catching the moonlight. It's a common sight on the night tours they sell to tourists, a way to experience the thrill of the ecosystem's nocturnal giants. But out here, with no guide, no guardrails, just one other man and a list of insane rules, it wasn't a thrill. It was a warning. The real tooth and claw dangers of this place were plain to see. It made me wonder what unseen dangers had inspired the rules on that card in my pocket. The beauty of this place was a lie. A deceptive skin hiding something ancient, hungry, and patient. And we were floating right in the middle of its hunting grounds. The first few hours of work were a grueling, sweat-soaked grind that pushed all thoughts of the strange rules to the back of my mind. The air was a wet blanket, so thick with humidity you could almost drink it. Mosquitoes, despite the repellent I'd bathed in, descended in whining clouds every time the breeze died down. The work was simple but relentless. Bait the hooks with shrimp and mojaras, cast into the inky blackness, and wait. The fishing was good. Too good. Almost every cast yielded a strike. We pulled in one fish after another, their silver bodies thrashing in the dim light of the boat's deck lamps. There were powerful line, stripping tarpon, their scales like polished chrome, stubborn redfish, bulldogging their way through the water, and the occasional speckled sea trout. Each time, the routine was the same. I'd haul the fish over the side, and Silas would look at it with a flat, appraising stare before unhooking it and tossing it back into the water. "That one must have been 20 pounds, I said, after a particularly strong snook fought me for 10 minutes. "Worth good money." "We don't keep the snook," Silas said, not looking at me. "Rule 5. We only kept the mangrove snapper, a much smaller, less impressive fish." When we finally landed the first one, Silas performed a bizarre ritual. He laid the fish on a small cutting board, and with a sharp fillet knife, he expertly sliced out its still, beating heart. He cut a small piece from it and tossed the morsel overboard. "An offering," he muttered, more to the water than to me. The rest of the fish, guts, bones, head and all, was not thrown back. He carried it to a small, rusted metal brazier bolted to the deck and set it on fire. A plume of greasy, foul-smelling smoke coiled into the night air, a stark violation of the otherwise pristine darkness. Every piece of organic waste from our work was to be burned. Nothing went overboard. It was inefficient, strange, and deeply unsettling. I was beginning to understand that this wasn't a fishing trip. It was a ceremony. The monotony and the heat were a potent combination, inducing a state of drowsy autopilot. My movements became mechanical, my thoughts drifting. To keep myself awake, I started to hum, a tuneless little melody from a song I barely remembered. The humming turned into a low, soft whistle. It was a sound of comfort, a small piece of human noise to push back against the oppressive, alien chorus of the swamp. I only realized my mistake when the world went silent. The steady, reliable thrum of the Cypress Witch's engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The abrupt absence of its noise was a physical blow, plunging us into a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. The cacophony of frogs and insects ceased at the exact same moment, as if a switch had been flipped. Silas, who had been baiting a line, froze solid, his head snapped up, his eyes wide with a kind of primal terror I had never seen on a human face. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, desperate hiss that cut through the silence like a razor. "What did you do?" My blood ran cold. The half-formed whistle died on my lips. "What? I didn't do anything." "You were whistling?" he accused, his voice trembling with a terrifying mixture of rage and fear. "Rule 3. You never whistle. You call the wind and what rides it." The The superstition about whistling challenging the wind was an old one, something I'd heard from sailors my whole life. But Silas's reaction told me this was no mere sailor's yarn. The engine failing at that exact moment, the entire swamp falling silent, it was too much to be a coincidence. The faulty technology, a classic horror trope, suddenly wasn't a trope at all. It was our reality, amplifying our isolation 100-fold. As if on cue, the natural sounds returned, but they were twisted, malevolent. The wind began to pick up, not as a gentle breeze, but in sharp, sighing gusts that rustled the miles of surrounding sawgrass. The sound wasn't like rustling leaves. It was sibilant, like a million hushed, conspiratorial whispers. The frog chorus started again, but the rhythm was off, their croaks sounding less like a natural symphony and more like mocking, guttural laughter. And then we heard it. Who? It was the call of an owl, but it was wrong. It was too deep, too loud, impossibly close. It wasn't the sound of a bird, it was a presence. The Seminole legends speak of the Stygiani's cry as a horrible, guttural sound, an omen of imminent death. This was that sound. It vibrated in my bones, a sound of pure menace that promised violence. Before I could even turn my head towards the sound, Silas was on me. He grabbed the front of my shirt, his knuckles white, and shoved my head down with brutal force. Rule 4, he snarled, his face inches from mine, his breath hot with panic. You heard nothing! Look at your feet! Don't... Up. His terror was more contagious than any virus. I was no longer a skeptic. I was a believer. I squeezed my eyes shut and stared down at the fiberglass deck of the boat, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. We stood there, frozen, two men in a small boat adrift in an ancient darkness, waiting for the thing we had summoned to pass us by. The silence stretched for an eternity. Then, a solid THUMP landed on the cabin roof directly above our heads. It was heavy. Far too heavy to be a bird, even a large one. My mind flashed to the stories of the skunk ape, the southern Bigfoot said to roam these swamps, but this felt different, older. A slow, scraping sound followed, the noise of long claws dragging across fiberglass. It was methodically, deliberately moving around up there, testing the structure. I couldn't help it. My will broke. I had to see. But I remembered Silas's warning. I didn't look up. I looked down. I risked a glance over the side of the boat, at the water's glassy, black surface. What I saw there will be burned into my memory until the day I die. The reflection was wrong. It wasn't a perfect mirror of our boat against the starry sky. The reflection was distorted, nightmarish. In the dark water, I could see the reflection of the cypress witch, but perched on its roof was a figure. A tall, emaciated, shadowy thing that was horribly, impossibly long. It had the vague shape of a man, but its head was tilted at a bird-like angle and too huge. Luminous discs glowed where its eyes should have been. It was a twisted hybrid of man and owl, a creature of pure nightmare pulled from the darkest corners of folklore. A strangled gasp escaped my lips, just as the thing in the reflection seemed to turn its head towards me. The boat's engine roared to life with a deafening explosion of sound. Silas had been frantically working the ignition, and it had finally caught. He slammed the throttle forward, and the cypress witch lurched, throwing me against the gunwale. When I looked back at the water, the reflection was normal again. The presence was gone. The whispering wind died down, and the frogs resumed their natural, rhythmic chorus. The world had returned to what passed for normal in this place. Silas didn't say a word. He just steered us away, his face a pale, sweat-slicked mask in the moonlight. We didn't talk for the rest of the night. We didn't have to. The rules were real, and we had just broken one. We caught no more fish. It was as if the water itself had turned barren, shunning us for our transgression. The offering had been rejected. We were no longer welcome. The first hint of dawn was a pale, sickly gray line on the eastern horizon, promising an end to the longest night of my life. The oppressive darkness began to recede. But the terror it had brought remained, a cold knot in my stomach. The air was still and heavy. As soon as the light was strong enough to see his face clearly, I confronted Silas. My voice was hoarse, cracking with fear and exhaustion. "What was that? You have to tell me what that thing was." Silas looked at me, his eyes hollowed out, aged a decade since sunset. He saw me not as a deckhand anymore, but as a liability, a fool who had stumbled into a church and desecrated the altar. He let out a long, shuddering breath, the sound of a man who had carried a terrible secret for too long. "The last kid I had out here," he began, his voice barely a whisper, "was like you, cocky. Thought the rules were a joke, a game." He stared out at the gray water, his gaze distant. He brought a banana on board, tucked it in his lunch sack. I didn't know until it was too late. I thought of Rule Fay 1, the most common, almost comical, of all maritime superstitions. But the way Silas spoke of it, there was no humor, only dread. "The fishing went dead," he continued, "instantly. Then the rot started. The bait turned foul in an hour. We both got sick, a fever that came on fast and hard." He laughed it off, said it was bad shrimp. That night, I was in the cabin, trying to sweat out the fever. I heard him scream, just once. When I got out on deck, he was gone. All that was left was his lunch sack and a single, half-eaten banana floating on the water. The story hung in the air between us, as thick and foul as the smoke from the brazier. A young man, vanished without a trace. Another statistic swallowed by the Everglades. A place with a long and storied history of disappearances that defied easy explanation. The banana wasn't the cause, it was an invitation. A sign of disrespect that broke the fragile truce. Just as I was trying to absorb the horror of his story, a new sound intruded upon our fragile silence. It started as a distant whine, but quickly grew into a deafening roar. Moments later, an airboat burst out from a narrow channel between the mangroves, its powerful fan engine tearing the morning stillness to shreds. It was a party boat, a garish tourist trap, with powerful floodlights cutting through the sacred gloom and loud, thumping music blaring from speakers. On its deck, a group of drunk college kids were shouting and laughing, their voices a profane intrusion into this ancient place. The conflict between the natural soundscape and their manufactured noise was a physical assault. They veered dangerously close to us, their wake rocking the cypress witch. One of them, a young man with a backwards baseball cap, saw us. He raised his beer can in a mock toast. "Look, locals!" he yelled to his friends. Then, seeing our grim faces, he did the worst possible thing. He cupped his hands around his mouth and let out a loud, stupid, mocking hoot. Who? Silas's face went white. "No," he breathed. It wasn't a warning. It was a prayer. The consequence was immediate. The roar of the airboat's engine choked and died, just as ours had. Their floodlights flickered violently, and then extinguished, plunging their boat into the same primordial darkness we inhabited. The sudden silence was punctuated by their confused, drunken shouts. "Hey! What gives? Dude, the engine's dead!" Then, from the dense, tangled darkness of a nearby mangrove island, came the answer. It wasn't the deep, resonant hoot from before. It was a shriek, a high, piercing scream of predatory fury that was followed by a heavy, wet splash. This was the set piece, the main event. Silas and I could only watch in frozen, muted horror. A shape, blacker than the shadows it emerged from, launched itself from the island onto the deck of the airboat. It was huge, taller than a man, impossibly thin, with long, spindly limbs that moved with a horrifying, jerky speed. It was the thing from the reflection, but now it was real, solid, and utterly terrifying. It was the Stygieni. We couldn't see the details, only its silhouette against the lightening sky. But we heard everything. The screams of the tourists were cut short, replaced by sickening, wet, tearing sounds. The crunch of bone, the heavy, meaty thuds of bodies hitting the deck. It was over in less than a minute. The creature was a whirlwind of violence, ripping them apart with a strength that was simply not of this world, driven by a singular, terrible purpose to feast on their hearts. Silence reclaimed the swamp once more, a silence now heavy with the weight of slaughter. The abandoned airboat drifted aimlessly, a floating tomb. My body was shaking uncontrollably, my mind struggling to process the atrocity I had just witnessed. Silas finally spoke, his voice dead, devoid of all emotion. "We're not fishing for snapper, Jack." I turned to look at him, my mind a blank slate of terror. "We're fishing for it," he clarified, his gaze fixed on the drifting airboat. "This whole thing, it's a ritual, an appeasement." The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The strange rules, the specific fish, the offering of the heart, the burning of the remains. It was all a tribute, a tax paid to the ancient, territorial entity that had claimed these waters long before men had names for them. The rules weren't just superstitions. They were the wards, the liturgical steps that allowed them to perform their grim duty without being devoured themselves. "The poison in the water," he whispered, "the mercury everyone talks about. It's not just from pollution. It's from it. Its presence taints the land, sickens the fish." I finally understood. We weren't fishermen. We were priests, unwilling acolytes in a forgotten, terrifying religion, tasked with feeding a god that, if left hungry, would feed on anyone who trespassed in its domain. The tourists hadn't just been killed for their foolishness. They had been the offering we had failed to provide. And now, its appetite whetted, the god of the swamp was turning its attention to us. The Stygieni, its hunger stoked, but not sated by the massacre on the airboat, now considered us the main course. The final hours before sunrise became a tense, claustrophobic siege. The vast, open water of the Everglades, which had felt so isolating before, now felt like a naked, exposed arena. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The creature didn't attack directly. It was intelligent, cruel. It began a campaign of psychological warfare. It circled our small boat, a silent shadow in the periphery. We'd hear a soft tapping on the hull, first on the port side, then instantly on the starboard. It was toying with us, a cat with two terrified mice. Then came the voices, faint, ghostly whispers carried on the wind, mimicking the last panicked shouts of the dead tourists. "Help me, it's in the water." Oh God, it was a monstrous, predatory ventriloquism designed to break our minds before it broke our bodies. I was on the verge of shattering. Every creak of the boat, every ripple on the water, sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I huddled in the center of the deck, clutching a gaff hook like a talisman, my eyes darting into the darkness. Silas, however, seemed to be galvanized by the sheer desperation of our situation. The hollowed out fear in his eyes was replaced by a hard, flinty resolve. He knew we couldn't just wait for dawn. We had to fight back. "There's a way," he rasped, his voice tight. "An old story. The medicine people knew. The Stygieni, it's a witch. To change to become that thing, it has to leave its human parts behind." He explained the core of the legend, the creature's one grotesque vulnerability. To transform, the witch vomits up its soul, its blood, its internal organs, and hangs them from the high branches of a tree, usually deep in the woods, away from prying eyes. Those organs are its anchor to its human form. If we find them, Silas said, his eyes burning with a mad hope, if we destroy them, it can't change back. The sun will burn it away. It will be trapped in its monster form. It was a plan born of folklore and desperation, our only weapon against the nightmare stalking us. But the plan was suicidal. The organs would be on one of the small cypress hammocks, the tree islands that dotted the swamp, and the creature would guard them with its life. One of us has to draw it away. Silas laid out the grim strategy. Keep it occupied. The other takes the dinghy to the island, finds the tree, destroys the soul. There was no choice to be made. I was younger, faster. Silas was the better captain, the one who knew how to handle the cypress witch. I would be the one to go. While Silas prepared to lead the creature on a chase across the bay, I untied the small, flat-bottomed dinghy, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage the knot. He handed me a flare gun and a rusty machete. For the organs, he said, and a can of gasoline. Burn them, burn it all. As I pushed off into the black water, Silas started the engine and roared away, heading for the far side of the bay. The Stygiani, letting out an enraged shriek, gave chase. I was alone, paddling a tiny boat towards a dark island, my only light the distant, bobbing stern light of the cypress witch and the horrifying, shadowy form in its wake. The journey to the cypress hammock was a nightmare in itself. The narrow waterway was a tunnel of tangled mangrove roots and hanging Spanish moss. The water was shallow, and my paddle scraped against unseen things below. I was terrified of running aground, of being trapped. The air was thick with the smell of decay and poisonous plants like poisonwood, which could raise rashes on the skin with a simple touch. I used my flashlight sparingly, sweeping its beam across the trees in short, panic bursts, terrified of what the light might reveal. I found the tree at the heart of the small island. It was an ancient, gnarled cypress, its branches like skeletal arms reaching for the sky. And hanging from them, suspended by glistening, sinewy threads, were the organs. It was the single most obscene sight I have ever witnessed. A pulsating, living mass of viscera, a heart, lungs, intestines, all glowing with a faint, sickly luminescence. It was the creature's soul, laid bare and vulnerable. I uncapped the can of gasoline and began to dose the hanging horror. The smell of petrol was sharp, clean, and blessedly modern in this ancient, foul place. But I was too slow. A piercing shriek ripped through the air from right behind me. The Stygiani had realized the deception. It burst through the trees, a 9-foot-tall whirlwind of claws and fury. I fired the flare gun directly at its face. The brilliant red projectile struck it in the chest, not harming it but momentarily blinding it with a shower of magnesium sparks. It gave me the second I needed. I threw my lit Zippo at the gasoline-soaked organs. They erupted in a pillar of fire, letting out a sound that was not of this world, a psychic scream that echoed in my skull, a chorus of agony and rage. The Stygiani shrieked in unison, a physical manifestation of the sound, and lunged for me. I scrambled backwards, falling into the murky water as it thrashed in the firelight, its form flickering and distorting. Just then, the first true rays of dawn pierced the canopy. Sunlight, pure and golden, streamed through the trees. When it touched the creature's skin, the Stygiani began to dissolve. It didn't burn, it unraveled, its solid form breaking down into black ash and shadow, its final, agonized cry absorbed by the morning light. I stumbled back to the ding and paddled towards the Cypress Witch, which was now drifting silently in the middle of the bay. I found Silas slumped over the console, his chest a bloody ruin of deep, raking claw marks. He was alive, but only just. He looked up at me, a faint, grim smile on his lips. "You did it, kid." He pressed a heavy, leather-bound journal into my hands. It was filled with spidery handwriting, detailing lore, celestial charts, and the locations of other, similar places around the world. "The river needs a keeper," he rasped, his breath catching. "The rules must be kept." With a final, shuddering sigh, his eyes went vacant. The horror wasn't over. I had survived, but I had not won. Victory was never an option. Months later, I stand on that same rickety dock. The Cypress Witch floats calmly, her scars now my scars. I am the captain now. I am the keeper. I see a young man walking towards me, his face etched with the same quiet desperation I once wore. He found my flyer, pinned to the same gas station bulletin board. I look him over, and with the dead, hollowed out seriousness that was once Silas's, I hand him a clean, newly laminated card. The cycle continues. The horror is not a monster that can be killed. It is a duty that must be served. It is a tide that never goes out. My name is Maya. There are creatures in the woods, and for the last 12 hours, we have had one of them chained in our shed. The idea belonged to Dr. Aris Thorne, my boss, the man whose obsessive quest for a creature of myth had led us here. Aris is our investigator, a disgraced folklorist who sees the being in the shed not as a monster, but as his ticket back to academic glory, the ultimate validation for a lifetime of being ridiculed. He is the reason we are all in this nightmare. Then there is Liam, hired for his steady hand and knowledge of these oppressive forests. Liam is our protector, a former park ranger whose solution to every problem is to aim a rifle at it. He sees the world as a series of threats to be managed. And right now, the thing in the shed, and whatever is lurking beyond the tree line, is the ultimate threat. He has appointed himself our leader, and in the vacuum of our fear, no one has argued. Javier is our guide, the quiet, watchful man Aris hired to navigate us through this wilderness. He moves with a ghost's silence, his eyes holding a deep, wary knowledge that makes me uneasy. He is meant to be our lifeline, but I see the way he looks at us, at the shed, with a simmering contempt. He is a man driven by a singular, desperate need to survive, and I fear he would sacrifice any of us to do it. And me. I am the innocent, the research assistant who was supposed to be documenting rare flora for graduate credits. I was promised a summer of genuine fieldwork, not helping to chain a nightmare to a post. I am the group's moral compass, but in a place like this, morality feels like a luxury we can no longer afford. We stand on the porch of the dilapidated cabin, a fractured council of four, staring at the weathered gray wood of the shed door. The elation of our successful capture has long since curdled into a thick, sour dread. The silence is heavy, broken only by the rhythmic clank of the iron chain against the packed dirt floor inside. It's a sound that measures the seconds of our new, terrible reality. The door won't hold, Liam says, his voice a low growl. He isn't looking at the shed, but at the forest that encircles us, his knuckles white where he grips his rifle. Not if its friends come calling. The door's integrity is secondary. Aris counters, his voice thin with excitement. He pushes his glasses up his nose, his eyes gleaming. What's important is that the specimen is contained. The implications are staggering. We should let it go. I whisper, the words feeling fragile in the heavy air. Aris, we have proof. Pictures, recordings. We don't have to keep it. Liam scoffs. And let it run back and tell the whole family where the buffet is. We're past that. He gestures toward the dense wall of trees. We have a hostage. That's our only leverage. It's not a hostage. It's a living being. I insist. It's a thing, Aris snaps. A biological paradox. Your sentimentality is a liability. Maya. Javier says nothing, just continues to sharpen a long hunting knife with a whetstone. The rhythmic shack of the stone on steel is the only answer I get. We are a group. Oh, we. But that collective identity is already fraying. In the beginning, during the hunt, we were a unit, operating with a shared purpose. We were in the forming stage, bound by the thrill of the chase. But now, with our prize locked away, the storm is gathering. The politeness has been stripped away, revealing the sharp edges of our true natures as we enter the storming phase, where conflict and power struggles begin to emerge. As the sun begins to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and blood, the forest seems to close in, watching, listening. The normal, comforting sounds of the woods fall away into a predatory silence. Then, a new sound starts, a soft, chittering noise from the deep woods, answered by another from a different direction, and then a third. It is complex, rhythmic, almost like a language. They're talking, Javier says, his voice so low it's almost a vibration. He has stopped sharpening his knife. We retreat inside as darkness falls, the world shrinking to the flickering light of our lanterns. Liam bars the door and checks the shutters. Aris sits at the table, frantically scribbling in his journal. Javier takes the first watch by a window, a silent statue in the gloom. I huddle in a corner, trying to stop shaking. The sounds from the forest grow more frequent, closer. They are circling us. My mind, starved of sleep and fed on fear, begins to play tricks on me. I see movement in the shadows, hear whispers just beneath the wind. The hours crawl by. The sounds from the woods continue their unnerving symphony. But the shed has gone quiet. The rhythmic clinking of the chain has stopped. What's it doing? I ask, my voice trembling. It doesn't sleep, Javier says from the window. It listens. As if to prove his point, a new sound comes from the shed. It isn't a clink or a scrape. It is a voice, a human voice, soft and clear, that cuts through the tension in the cabin like a razor. It is the voice of a child. Maya. The voice calls, a perfect, heartbreaking imitation of my little brother, who died from a fever 7 years ago. Maya, I'm scared. Why did you leave me in the dark? The voice of my dead brother echoed in the suffocating confines of the cabin, and the world tilted on its axis. It wasn't just a voice, it was him. The exact pitch, the slight lisp he had before his 7th birthday, the way he said my name. It was a phantom limb I hadn't felt in years, suddenly aching with an impossible, agonizing reality. My breath hitched, a sob catching in my throat. For a single, insane moment, I believed it. I believed he was out there, in the dark, in the shed. Don't listen to it, Lamb snarled, his voice cutting through my grief like a serrated blade. He grabbed my arm, his grip painfully tight. It's a trick. It's trying to get in your head. A trick. Aris breathed, his eyes wide with manic discovery, completely oblivious to my tears. This is more than a trick. It's adaptive vocal mimicry. It's learning. It must have pulled that from your mind, Maya. Do you understand the implications? He fumbled for his journal, his hands shaking with excitement, not fear. I wrenched my arm from Liam's grasp, staring at Aris with disbelief. My brother is not your implication. The cabin, which had felt like a fragile sanctuary, had now become a pressure cooker. The 4 of us were trapped, not just by the things outside, but by the warring impulses inside. We had plunged headfirst into the chaotic heart of the storming phase, a stage of conflict and power struggles that felt impossible to escape. The trust we had was a currency we had already spent. The creature in the shed fell silent, its psychological bomb having been successfully detonated. But the things outside took its cue. The subtle, chittering language of the forest was replaced by a more direct assault. A heavy thump struck the side of the cabin, making us all jump. Then another against the boarded-up window. It wasn't the sound of a branch falling. It was the deliberate, rhythmic pounding of a fist. "They're testing the walls," Javier said, his voice flat. He moved away from the window, his face pale in the lantern light. "They know we're in here, and they know what we have." The siege had begun in earnest. The psychological warfare from the outside creatures was escalating, a coordinated effort to exploit the fractures the captive was creating from within. They were no longer just circling. They were probing, attacking. Shadows, impossibly thin and fast, would flit across the tiny gaps in the window shutters, gone before our eyes could properly register them, the terrifying signature of the hide-a-behind. The sounds changed, too. They began to mimic us. A perfect imitation of Liam clearing his throat came from the east wall. A distorted version of Aris's excited muttering came from the west. They were using our own sounds to surround us, to make the world outside a twisted mirror of the prison inside. The internal conflict festered. Liam and Javier formed a grim, silent alliance, their shared pragmatism a bulwark against what they saw as Aris's madness and my emotional weakness. They spoke in low murmurs, cleaning their weapons, their movements economical and tense. They were a faction of two, preparing for a war they believed was inevitable. Aris, on the other hand, became more and more agitated, pacing the small floor space. He saw our predicament, not as a struggle for survival, but as the greatest scientific experiment in history. "It's communicating with them," he said, gesturing wildly at the shed. "The one we have is the Nexus, a field commander. It's relaying our weaknesses, our emotional states. This is a level of social intelligence it's unheard of." His excitement was obscene. He was a man watching his own execution, marveling at the design of the guillotine. The stress and lack of sleep were fraying our minds, degrading our ability to think clearly. I felt caught in the middle, my grief and fear a paralyzing fog. The voice of my brother played on a loop in my head, a constant, agonizing whisper. The breaking point came on the second night of the siege. The pounding on the walls was more insistent, the mimicked voices more frequent. We were running low on lamp oil, and the shadows in the cabin were growing deeper, more menacing. I couldn't stand the sight of Aris's feverish scribbling any longer. While he was distracted, arguing with Liam about rationing the last of our potable water, I went to his pack. I just wanted something, anything, to make sense. I found his journal. The first half was filled with the notes I expected. Observations, hypotheses, sketches of the creature. But tucked into a flap at the back was a smaller leather-bound notebook I had never seen before. It was filled with Aris's cramped, spidery handwriting. It wasn't scientific observation. It was a record of his research before the expedition. My blood ran cold as I read. He had known. He had known all along. The notebook was filled with translations of obscure local folklore and newspaper clippings about disappearances in this very forest dating back decades. He hadn't just stumbled upon a legend, he had sought it out. He knew the creature wasn't just an unclassified animal. The folklore called it a leshy, a guardian spirit that turned vengeful when disrespected. It described its ability to mimic voices, to lead travelers astray, to command the other creatures of the wood. It described its particular hatred for those who sought to capture or harm what it protected. Aris hadn't come here to discover a new species. He had come here to prove a myth, knowing full well that the myth was a warning. He had lied to us. He had led us into the lair of a vengeful god, and he had never told us the true nature of the danger. The trust I had in him, the last thread of our original group dynamic, didn't just break, it vaporized. "You knew," I said, my voice shaking with a rage so cold it burned. I held up the small notebook. "You knew what this thing was. You knew people had died." All three men turned to look at me. Liam's eyes narrowed. Javier stopped cleaning his rifle and stood up slowly. Aris's face went from academic curiosity to the pale, pinched look of a cornered rat. "Maya, you don't understand," he stammered. "The data, the opportunity. Liam spat the word like poison. He strode across the room and snatched the notebook from my hand. He scanned the pages, his face growing darker with every line. "You son of a bitch. You led us into a trap." "It wasn't a trap. It was a calculated risk," Aris shrieked, his composure finally shattering. "For what? For your name in a book," Liam roared, throwing the notebook to the floor. The argument that followed was no longer about strategy or leadership. It was raw, primal, and full of hate. It was the complete breakdown of our group, the final, violent spasm of the storming phase. Liam lunged for Aris, not to hit him, but to grab his primary journal from the table. "I'm burning this garbage. We're getting out of here."
"No,"
Aris screamed, a sound of pure desperation. He threw himself at Liam, trying to wrestle the journal away. It happened in a blur of motion and shouting. Javier moved to separate them. I screamed for them to stop. In the struggle, Aris shoved Liam with all his might. Liam stumbled backward, crashing hard against the small table holding our main lantern. The lantern tipped, fell, and shattered on the wooden floor. The flame hissed out, plunging the cabin into an almost absolute darkness. The only light a sliver of moon through a crack in the shutters. For a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a deafening beenge. The rifle in Liam's hands, jarred by the fall, had discharged. A choked gasp came from the darkness near the door. A heavy thump. Then, a wet, gurgling sound that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Liam fumbled for his flashlight, his hands trembling. The beam cut through the blackness, shaking wildly, and landed on Javier. He was slumped against the wall, a dark, blossoming stain spreading across his chest. His eyes were wide with shock, his mouth opening and closing silently. He was dead, killed not by the monsters outside, but by us, by our fear, our anger, our complete and utter failure to be human. The flashlight beam wavered, catching the door of the shed in its sweep. And from within, a new sound began. It wasn't a voice. It was a low, dry, mirthless laugh. It knew. It had watched us tear ourselves apart, and it was enjoying the show. The gunshot's echo faded, leaving behind a silence thicker and more profound than any that had come before. It was a silence filled with the smell of gunpowder and the coppery tang of fresh blood. Javier's body was a crumpled heap by the door, a dark monument to our failure. The group was no longer just broken, it was annihilated. The concept of "we" had died with him. There was only me, a killer and a coward, trapped in a box with a corpse while the devil laughed outside. This was the final stage, the adjourning, not a polite parting of ways, but a violent, agonizing collapse into mourning and despair. Liam's flashlight beam trembled, painting frantic strokes of light across the horror he had wrought. The dry, mirthless laughter from the shed finally ceased. As if the creature had savored the moment, and was now content to wait, to let the poison work. He came at me, Liam stammered, the words hollow, his protector archetype shattering into a million pieces. He was no longer a leader, just a man with a smoking rifle and blood on his hands that wasn't a monster's.
You killed him!
Eris shrieked, scrambling away from Liam, his back hitting the far wall.
You murderer! This is on you!
Liam roared, whirling to face Eris, the flashlight beam blinding him.
You brought us here! Your lies, your damned obsession!
The blame, hot and acidic, filled the space between them. Their conflict was no longer about strategy. It was the raw, desperate thrashing of drowning men. Their logic, already strained by days of fear and sleeplessness, was now completely gone, replaced by pure, reactive emotion. I was frozen, my mind a maelstrom of shock and a terrifying, dawning clarity. The laughter. It wasn't just a sound of amusement. It was strategic. The creature had pushed us, prodded us with perfectly chosen words and sounds, waiting for the inevitable crack in our foundation. It had used my dead brother's voice to shatter my composure. It had used the silence to amplify our paranoia. It had orchestrated this. The being in the shed wasn't a prisoner of war. It was the enemy general, and we had brought him into our command tent. "We have to do something," I said, my voice sounding distant, disconnected from my body. "We can't just wait here." That was the spark they needed. A new focus for their terror. A desperate, final plan. "The fire," Eris said, his eyes wild. He scrambled to his feet and grabbed his scattered notes. The folklore. Some spirits of this type, these guardians, they can be driven away by fire or appeased by it. A great fire. A sacrifice. A fire. Liam seized on the word. Action was the only thing that could keep his guilt at bay. We'll burn it. We burned the whole damn shed to the ground with that thing inside it. It was a plan born of madness and terror, a Hail Mary based on corrupted information and blind panic. They saw it as an escape, a final act of defiance. I saw it for what it was. The last move in a game the creature had been playing from the start. I looked from Liam's desperate face to Eris's terrified one, and I finally understood the full, crushing weight of our arrogance. We had walked into its forest, its home, and stolen one of its own. This wasn't a random attack, it was a punishment. The Leshy was a guardian spirit, and we had committed a sacrilege. "No," I whispered, but my voice was lost in their frantic preparations. They moved with the jerky, unnatural energy of puppets. Liam found the last can of lamp oil. Eris, clutching his notebook like a Bible, began tearing pages out, muttering about kindling and offerings. They were going to march out there and perform a final, stupid act that would seal our doom. As Liam unbarred the door, a profound silence fell over the forest. The chittering, the pounding, the mimicked voices, all of it stopped. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise had ever been. It was the held breath before the killing blow. Liam kicked the door open and charged into the night, a man running toward his own damnation. Eris followed, a gibbering acolyte. I stayed on the threshold, a spectator to the end of my world. Liam reached the shed and began splashing the oil onto the dry, rotting wood. Eris threw his precious notes, the culmination of his life's work, onto the pyre. The creature inside was silent. It didn't rattle its chain. It didn't make a sound. It was waiting. Liam fumbled with his lighter, the flint sparking uselessly in his trembling hands. Once, twice. On the third try, a tiny flame bloomed. He tossed it. The oil ignited with a deafening whoosh. Flames erupted, climbing the walls of the shed with an hungry, orange light. For a moment, it looked like they had won. Liam stood back, panting, his face a mask of savage triumph. Aris was on his knees, weeping. Then, from within the inferno, the chain clanked. Once, twice. Then it fell to the ground with a heavy, final thud. The shed door, now engulfed in flames, was kicked open from the inside. The creature that emerged was not burning. It stood silhouetted against the fire, taller than I remembered, as tall as the trees themselves. Its form seemed to shift, its bark like skin untouched by the heat. It raised its long, spindly arms, and from the deep woods, its brethren answered. They came not as a chaotic mob, but as a disciplined army, their forms half seen, slipping between the trees, their movements perfectly coordinated. They had been waiting for this signal. The creature in the shed hadn't been a hostage. It had been a beacon. Liam screamed and raised his rifle, but it was too late. A shadow detached itself from the tree line, impossibly fast, and was on him before he could fire. I didn't see the blow, but I heard the sickening crunch and saw him fall. Aris didn't even try to run. He simply knelt there, staring at the fiery god he had unleashed, until another shadow enveloped him. I stumbled back inside the cabin and slammed the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was alone, the last one. That was all that remained of Weh. My internal monologue was a scream that wouldn't come out, a torrent of fear and regret. The sounds outside stopped. The fire crackled, but the creatures were silent. I stood in the dark, listening. My breath held tight in my chest. I knew it was coming. I knew it had all been for me. The mimicry of my brother's voice, the psychological torment, it had been personal. This was my reckoning. The front door of the cabin splintered. A tall, impossibly thin figure stepped through the ruined frame. It was the creature from the shed. It moved without a sound, its blank face fixed on me. It didn't need to hide anymore. There was nothing left to hide behind. It stopped a few feet away, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of its ancient, implacable intelligence. It had studied us. It had learned our fears, our weaknesses, our pathetic, predictable patterns of self-destruction. And it had used them to orchestrate our demise with the precision of a master composer. The greatest horror wasn't the monster in front of me. It was the chilling, absolute certainty that we had done this to ourselves. We were not victims. We were fools. It raised a long, clawed hand, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. The last thing I heard was not a roar or a scream, but a soft, final sound, like a single leaf falling to the forest floor. My name is Dr. Alastair Finch. I am a geologist. My work is a study of pressure and time, of the slow, inexorable forces that build mountains and grind them back to dust. I have always found comfort in the logic of rock, in the story told by strata and stone. It is a narrative that is vast, impersonal, and, above all, rational. I am writing this account because the story I now carry in my mind is none of those things. It is intimate, malicious, and utterly insane. I write this because my friends, Dr. Eleanor Vance and Ben Carter, deserve more than the dismissive official report. Lost to an avalanche, bodies unrecovered. That serves as their epitaph. I write this because I need to believe that putting the events into words, arranging them in a sequence, might somehow contain them. It is a futile hope, I know. Some things, once seen, can never be contained again. Our expedition was born from Ellie's particular genius. Dr. Eleanor Vance was a historian at the University of Colorado, but that title is woefully insufficient. She was a pioneer in what she playfully called psychohistory, a discipline of her own making that studied the lingering emotional and psychological input of human events upon a landscape. Her thesis was that places, especially those of great ambition and great failure, retained a kind of memory. She argued that ghost towns were not merely collections of rotting timber. They were scars on the land, resonating with the spectral energy of hope and despair. Her focus for this trip was Lulu City, once the largest mining boomtown in what is now Rocky Mountain National Park. She spoke of it not as a ruin, but as a disintegrating monument to ruined dreams, a place where one could almost feel the ghosts of the past. Her enthusiasm was infectious, and her academic rigor was unimpeachable. She wanted to document the site, to take samples, to write the definitive paper on the psychic death of a frontier town. I was the geologist, the hard science to her more esoteric brand of history. My role was to analyze the geological context of Lulu City, to understand the rock that had promised so much and delivered so little, leading to the town's swift abandonment. I was there to ground her theories in the physical world, to explain the mineralogy that had sparked a brief, frantic gold rush and the unforgiving topography that had ultimately extinguished it. The third member of our party, our anchor to the practical world, was Ben Carter. Ben was a wildlife biologist, a man who had spent 2 decades with the U.S. Forest Service before becoming a private guide and consultant. He was, without exaggeration, the most competent man I have ever known. The Rockies were not just his office, they were his native language. He could read a game trail like a sentence, predict weather from the smell of the air, and identify every plant, animal, and bird by sight or sound. He was a man of empirical evidence, a skeptic of anything that couldn't be tracked, measured, or dissected. He viewed Ellie's theories with a kind of affectionate amusement, but he respected her intellect. He agreed to guide us because he was a friend, and because the opportunity to spend a week in the deep backcountry, observing elk herds and checking for signs of pine beetle infestation, was his idea of a perfect holiday. The three of us represented a complete system of inquiry. Ellie had the human past, I had the deep, geological past, and Ben had the living, breathing present. We believed, with the quiet confidence of experts, that there was no phenomenon we might encounter in those mountains that our combined knowledge could not classify, explain, and understand. That was our first and most fatal mistake. We were setting out to study a place of failure, never imagining that we were walking directly into our own. The journey began as all such expeditions do, with a sense of boundless optimism and the clean, sharp bite of high-altitude air. We started our trek from the Dunraven trailhead on the park's less traveled west side, our packs meticulously organized, our permits in order. Ben, in his element, ran us through a final gear check with the stern patience of a drill sergeant. He inspected the seams on our tents, the expiration dates on our emergency flares, and the seals on our mandatory park-issued bear-resistant food canisters. "Remember the rules," he said, tapping the side of my canister with a thick finger. "Food, trash, anything with a scent, toothpaste, deodorant, all of it, goes in here. And the canister stays at least 200 feet from the tent, triangle formation with you, and the cooking area. We're not giving a black bear any reason to get curious." It was a lecture we had heard before, but we listened dutifully. We were professionals, and we respected the rules. The regulations of the National Park Service are not arbitrary. They are a script for survival, written in the hard, won experience of countless encounters with the known dangers of the wilderness. We followed them to the letter. We were not careless city dwellers stumbling into the wild. We were prepared. We were competent. And it made no difference at all. The rules we so carefully followed were designed to protect us from bears and mountain lions. They offered no guidance on how to deal with something that wasn't interested in our food, something that was interested only in us. The first day's hike was magnificent. We moved through forests of aspen and pine, the trail climbing steadily, the world of roads and cell signals falling away behind us. We made camp that first evening at a designated site called Halfway, a beautiful spot nestled in a stand of lodgepole pines with a clear, fast-moving creek nearby for water. As the sun began to set, the sky bled into shades of orange and purple, and the distant peaks of the never-summer mountains began to shift in color. They became a deep, ethereal blue. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Ellie said, her voice soft with awe. "Really scattering," I said, unable to resist the geological impulse. "It's the same reason the sky is blue. Sunlight is made of a spectrum of colors, each with a different wavelength. Blue light has a very short wavelength, so it scatters more easily when it hits the molecules in the atmosphere. The more atmosphere you look through, like when you're looking at a distant mountain, the more blue light gets scattered toward your eyes, making the mountain itself appear blue." Ellie smiled. "There's always a scientific explanation, isn't there?" Alistair. She pulled her jacket tighter around her shoulders and looked into the darkening woods. The old prospectors around here had a different one, a story. Ben, who was filtering water by the creek, grunted. "Here we go." "Oh, hush you," she said, nudging him with her boot. "It's called The Legend of the Blue Mist. It dates back to the 1880s. Around the time Lulu City was dying out, there was a prospector. They called him Miner Bill. He was known to be a bit eccentric. Spent a year in an asylum, apparently, before coming up here to stake his claims in Horseshoe Park." She had our full attention now. Her voice was perfect for storytelling, a low, captivating cadence that drew you in. Bill lived alone in a small cabin. When he'd come into town for supplies, he'd ramble to himself, talking about the divine, and about a deep, abiding fear of something he called the blue mist. He claimed that on cloudy nights, a strange, thick blue mist would roll in around his cabin. It wasn't fog, he said. It was different, colder, and within the mist, a being would manifest. I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the evening chill. The being, whatever it was, always left tracks. Ellie continued, her eyes wide in the flickering firelight. 3 toed claw marks deep in the snow or the mud. Marks on the trees, too. Animals would turn up dead near his cabin, nothing left but bones, and Bill was convinced it was the work of this thing in the mist. Then, one spring, Bill went missing. A search party found him, or what was left of him. Just his bones, picked clean, surrounded by those same 3 toed animal tracks. A profound silence fell over our camp, broken only by the crackle of the fire and the rush of the creek. Ben was the first to speak, forcing a chuckle. "Sounds like a classic campfire story. A boogeyman cooked up by lonely, half-mad prospectors to explain a mountain lion attack and the effects of bad moonshine." "Probably," Ellie conceded, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Still, it's a fascinating piece of folklore. A perfect example of how people project their fears onto the landscape." I agreed with Ben's logic, of course. It was the only explanation that made sense. But as I settled into my sleeping bag that night, listening to the wind sighing through the pines, I couldn't shake the image of those 3 toed tracks. Long after Ellie and Ben's soft snores filled the tent, I lay awake, staring into the impenetrable blackness beyond the thin nylon wall. An unnatural silence seemed to press in from the forest, a quiet so deep it felt like a held breath. And for the first time in my life, I felt the unnerving, prickling sensation of being watched by something I could not see. The sun rose the next morning with a brutal, indifferent clarity, burning away the shadows and the lingering unease of the night. In the sharp light of day, my nocturnal anxieties felt foolish, the product of a crackling fire and a well-told ghost story. Ben was already up, his movements economical and precise as he prepared coffee. He was humming a tuneless, contented sound that was as solid and reassuring as the granite peaks around us. "Sleep well?" he asked, handing me a steaming mug. "Like a rock." I lied, the words tasting metallic. Ellie emerged from the tent, stretching like a cat. "Did you hear that all last night?" "Sounded like a bar doll, but we're a bit high for them." Ben shrugged. "Probably a great horned. They're all over. Sound can play tricks out here." He glanced at me, a knowing look in his eye. "Spooked by Minor Bill's ghost, Alistair?" I forced a laugh. "Hardly. I was just contemplating the thermodynamic properties of my sleeping bag." The lie was thin, but it served its purpose. We were scientists, after all. An ecologist, a geologist, a historian. We dealt in facts and evidence, not in bumps in the night. The feeling of being watched, the oppressive silence. It was just my brain playing tricks on me. A phenomenon perhaps explainable by temporal lobe lability or some other neurogenic process that creates such experiences. We packed up camp, adhering to the strict leave no trace principles, and were back on the trail by 8. The landscape began to change as we gained elevation. The lodgepole pines gave way to sparser forests of subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce. The trail grew steeper, a rugged path of stone and earth that followed the tireless ascent of the terrain. We were truly in the backcountry now, the last vestiges of the civilized world a distant memory. The air was thin and clean, and the silence was no longer menacing, but majestic. For a few hours, I felt my unease melt away, replaced by the familiar, grounding rhythm of the hike. It was Ben who found them. He stopped so abruptly that I almost walked into him. He was staring at a patch of damp earth just off the trail, his usual easygoing expression replaced by one of intense, professional focus. "What is it?" Ellie asked, coming up beside him. "Tracks," he said, his voice low. He crouched down, his fingers tracing the air just above the impression. "Odd ones." I knelt beside him. There in the mud were 3 distinct prints. Each had 3 long, slender toes, tipped with what looked like a deep claw mark. They were arranged in a tight, almost bird-like pattern, but they were far too large for any bird I knew of. And the depth of the impressions suggested a significant weight. They were eerily similar to the tracks Ellie had described from the legend of Minor Bill. "What do you make of it, Ben?" I asked. He was silent for a long moment, his brow furrowed. "I don't know," he admitted, and the simple admission sent a fresh spike of dread through me. Ben knew everything about these mountains. For him to be stumped was like a priest admitting he didn't recognize a crucifix. The 3-toed pattern is typical of birds, like a grouse or a turkey, but these are too big, too deep, and there's no rear pointing hallux mark. It's not a bear or a mountain lion. Their tracks are completely different. Not a deer or an elk, obviously. It almost looks like 3 tracks overlapping. He poked at the edge of one print, but the displacement of the mud is all wrong. Whatever made this, it put its foot down right here. Ellie was captivated. Could it be a deformity? A bear with a birth defect? Possible, but unlikely to be 3 of them, all walking in a perfect line. Ben said, pointing further up the trail. The tracks continued, marching in a straight, deliberate path that crossed the trail and disappeared into the dense undergrowth on the other side. And look at the stride. It's long, longer than any animal I'd expect to see up here. We stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the impossible prints. Ben, the man of evidence, was confronted with evidence he couldn't explain. Ellie, the psychohistorian, looked as though she had just found the Rosetta Stone of her field. And I, the geologist, felt the solid ground of my rational world begin to fracture. We were miles from any road, in a wilderness governed by the immutable laws of biology and physics. And yet, here was a set of tracks that belonged to nothing. The rest of the hike to Lulu City was a quiet, tense affair. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the wind made me jump. The majestic wilderness now felt alien and hostile. We were intruders here, and we were being watched. We arrived at the site of Lulu City in the late afternoon. It was less a ghost town and more a ghost of a town. A few crumbling log cabins, their roofs long collapsed, stood like skeletal remains in a high-altitude meadow. The Colorado River, little more than a boisterous creek here, tumbled past the ruins. The air was thick with a profound sense of failure. You could almost feel the desperation of the miners who had flocked here in 1879, chasing rumors of gold, only to be defeated by the brutal winters and the low-grade ore. "This is it," Ellie breathed, her eyes sweeping across the scene. "This is what I was talking about. It's not just history, it's an emotional scar. The weight of all that broken hope, it's still here." She was right. The place felt heavy, sorrowful. It was a landscape haunted by memory. We set up our camp in a designated site, a few hundred yards from the main ruins, following all the park regulations to the letter. We placed our bare canisters a careful 200 feet away, cooked our meal, and tried to pretend this was just another night on the trail. But the easy camaraderie of the first night was gone, replaced by a brittle tension. Ben was uncharacteristically quiet, cleaning his gear with a focused intensity that betrayed his unease. Ellie was scribbling furiously in her notebook, her academic excitement warring with a palpable fear. As dusk settled, the temperature plummeted. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue, became overcast with a speed that felt unnatural. And then, the mist began to roll in. It wasn't like normal fog. This was the blue mist from the legend. And my scientific mind scrambled to explain it. It wasn't Rayleigh scattering, the phenomenon that makes distant mountains appear blue. This was close, tangible. It wasn't the release of volatile organic compounds from the pines, which can create a blue haze. This was thicker, colder, and it seemed to absorb the light rather than scatter it. It swirled in strange, oily eddies, clinging to the ground and weaving through the skeletal remains of Lulu City. A deep, penetrating cold came with it, a chill that went straight to the bone, far colder than the ambient temperature drop should have allowed. "My God," Ellie whispered, staring into the roiling vapor. "It's real." Ben had his hand on the handle of the small hatchet he kept on his belt. Everyone stay close to the fire. The world outside our small circle of firelight dissolved into a swirling blue, gray nothingness. The silence from the first night returned, but this time it was worse. It was a predatory silence, filled with a terrifying sense of anticipation. And then we heard it. It started as a faint clicking sound, like rocks being tapped together. Then came a low chittering, a sound that was horribly, unsettlingly organic. It was followed by a sound that I will never be able to adequately describe. It was a mimicry of a human voice, but hideously distorted, as if a recording was being played backward and forward at the same time. It formed something that was almost a word, a question, but the sound was stretched and mangled, filled with a wet, guttural static. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was not a known animal. This was not a trick of the wind. This was something intelligent, something malevolent. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. My scientific framework, the lens through which I viewed the entire universe, shattered. The world was not a logical, ordered place. It was a place of impossible tracks, of sentient mists, of voices that mocked the very concept of language. I felt a surge of primal terror, so profound it was almost religious, a feeling of being in the presence of something ancient and utterly inimical to human life. Suddenly, Ben let out a sharp, choked cry. He was staring past me, his face a mask of disbelief and horror. I spun around. For a split second, through a gap in the swirling blue mist, I saw a shape. It was tall and impossibly thin, a stick, figure silhouette of skeletal limbs that seemed to bend at the wrong angles. Its form was gaunt, emaciated, yet it moved with a horrifying speed. But the most terrible thing was its head. It was a long, narrow skull, like that of a deer or elk, but bleached white and adorned with a rack of dark, jagged antlers. And from the empty sockets, 2 points of faint, blue light glowed with cold, predatory intelligence. Then it was gone, swallowed by the mist. A scream tore from Ellie's throat. Ben scrambled backward, tripping over a log. I was frozen, my mind unable to process the abomination I had just witnessed. It was a creature from a nightmare, a thing that should not exist. It was a Wendigo, a spirit of the hungry north, a myth of starvation and cannibalism made flesh, and it was hunting us. The silence that followed was broken by a new sound. A soft, rhythmic scraping. It was coming from the direction of our bear canisters. Scrape, scrape, scrape. Then, a loud crack, like thick plastic shattering under immense pressure. Ben's face went pale. "It's not after our food," he whispered, his voice trembling. "It's showing us it can get to it. It's telling us we're the only thing on the menu." Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It strips away reason, dissolves expertise, and leaves behind only the raw, screaming animal instinct to survive. In that moment, huddled by our dying fire, the three of us, the scientist, the historian, the survivalist, were reduced to nothing more than prey. The sound of our bear canisters being destroyed, not by a hungry animal, but by a calculating intelligence, was the sound of our world ending. It was a declaration. The rules we lived by, the careful preparations we had made, were a joke. "It's playing with us," Ellie whispered, her voice ragged with terror. She was rocking back and forth, her arms wrapped around her knees. "The legends, they say the Wendigo enjoys the fear. It savors it. The hunt is the real meal." Ben, who had scrambled back to his feet, was a statue carved from ice. The hatchet was still in his hand, but it looked like a child's toy against the memory of that skeletal form. "Stay in the light," he commanded, his voice a low growl that barely masked a tremor. "Alistair, get more wood. Now." His order cut through my paralysis. I moved, my limbs feeling clumsy and disconnected, and began grabbing any piece of dry wood I could find near the edge of our camp. My hands shook so violently I could barely grip the branches. Every foray into the edge of the darkness was a fresh wave of terror. The blue mist eddied and flowed, just beyond the fire's reach, a shimmering, malevolent curtain. I felt its coldness, a palpable pressure against my skin. I could feel its eyes on me, the cold, blue pinpricks of light I had seen in that impossible, antlered skull. The night became a waking nightmare, a siege of psychological warfare. The creature never showed itself again, but its presence was a constant, suffocating weight. It circled our camp, a predator testing the strength of our cage. We heard the clicking sounds, sometimes close, sometimes far. Then came the mimicry. It started with a perfect imitation of a bird call, a Stellar's J, but it was wrong. It was midnight, and the sound was hollow, distorted. Then it began to mimic our voices. Ellie, a voice whispered from the mist, a perfect copy of my own. Come out, Ellie. I found something. Ellie let out a strangled sob and pressed herself against Ben, who stood with his back to the fire, hatchet raised, staring into the blue void. Ben, a different voice called, this one a grotesque parody of Ellie's, high-pitched and stretched like taffy. Help me. I'm lost. It was a calculated cruelty, designed to fray our nerves, to turn us against each other, to break our minds before it broke our bodies. The sounds were punctuated by long stretches of that profound, listening silence. We fed the fire obsessively, our dwindling woodpile a measure of our remaining time. We didn't speak. There was nothing to say. Our reality had been dismantled, and we were adrift in a landscape of pure malevolence. I am a geologist. I understand pressure. I have studied the immense forces that can bend and break solid rock over millennia. But the pressure of that night was something else entirely. It was the pressure of a single, focused will, a predatory consciousness that was actively, intelligently trying to unmake us. My scientific mind, my anchor in a rational world, was gone. In its place was a raw, primal terror and a single, recurring thought: we are going to die here. Dawn, when it finally came, was not a reprieve. It was an illumination of our doom. The blue mist did not burn away with the first rays of sun. It seemed to recede, to draw back into the trees, as if its work was done for the moment. The air warmed, but the coldness inside us remained. In the gray morning light, we looked at each other and saw the same hollow-eyed exhaustion, the same stark terror. Ben was the first to move. "The canisters," he said, his voice a rasp. We walked, huddled together like frightened children. The 200 feet to where we had stored our food. The sight that greeted us was worse than anything I could have imagined. The bare canisters, made of a high-impact polymer designed to withstand the full force of a 600-pound grizzly, were not just broken. They were obliterated, shattered into hundreds of small, sharp-edged fragments, scattered across the ground as if a bomb had gone off inside them. Our food, our toothpaste, our supplies were smeared and trampled into the mud amidst the plastic shrapnel. "No animal did this," I said, my voice barely a whisper, the force required. "It wasn't trying to get the food," Ben said, his eyes scanning the tree line. "It was sending a message. It can get to us whenever it wants. The canisters, the tent, none of it matters. We were defenseless. We had no food, no way to call for help, and we were a full day's hard hike from the trailhead. And we knew, with a certainty that settled in our bones, that the thing was still out there watching us. Waiting. We have to move," Ben said, taking charge, his training kicking in despite the impossible circumstances. "We'll pack up only what's essential: the tent, sleeping bags, water filter, first aid. We leave everything else. We move as fast as we can. We don't stop." The plan was desperate, a sliver of hope in an ocean of despair. As we frantically stuffed our gear into our packs, our hands clumsy with fear and cold, I saw Ellie staring at the ruins of a nearby cabin. "It's the hunger," she said, her voice distant. "It's an Algonquin legend. The Wendigo is the spirit of insatiable hunger, of starvation in the winter. It's created when a man resorts to cannibalism. It grows larger with every meal, but its hunger is never satisfied. It is gluttony and greed made flesh." "Ellie, not now," Ben snapped. "Don't you see?" She insisted, her eyes wild. This place, Lulu City, it was a place of failure, of desperate greed. The miners who came here were starving for wealth. They failed. Maybe one of them didn't fail. Maybe one of them found a different kind of sustenance. Her words hung in the air, a theory more terrifying than any ghost story. The idea that this creature wasn't just a random monster, but a direct result of the history of this place, a psychic scar given monstrous form, was too much to bear. We started our retreat, a forced march of pure terror. We didn't run, but our pace was frantic. Every shadow seemed to hold a skeletal shape. Every gust of wind sounded like a mocking whisper. The beautiful, majestic Rockies had transformed into a labyrinth of death, and we were not alone. About an hour into our hike, we found the tracks again. They were on the trail ahead of us, fresh in the damp earth. 3 long toes, a deep claw mark. But this time, they were different. They were deeper, the stride longer, and they were leading us. It's hurting us. Ben breathed, his face ashen. It's not just following. It's driving us somewhere. The psychological pressure ratcheted up to an unbearable level. We were no longer fleeing. We were being manipulated, puppets in a terrifying game. The creature was toying with us, demonstrating its power, its control over our fate. We were on its trail, not the other way around. We came to a steep, narrow section of the path that cut across a scree slope. Loose rock and gravel shifted under our boots, threatening to send us sliding down the mountainside. It was a place that required careful footing, a place where we had to slow down. It was a perfect ambush point. As I placed my foot on a large, flat rock, I heard a sound from above, not the clicking or the voice, but the sharp crack of rock against rock. I looked up. High on the slope above us, a boulder the size of a small car was dislodged. It wasn't a natural rockfall. It was pushed. Movi. Ben screamed. We scrambled, adrenaline surging through us. The boulder crashed down the slope, missing us by feet, but unleashing a cascade of smaller rocks and debris. I threw myself flat, covering my head as stones rained down around me. The air filled with dust and the sharp smell of fractured granite. When the dust settled, I pushed myself up, my ears ringing. Ben was a few feet away, helping a terrified, weeping Ellie to her feet. But something was wrong. The configuration was wrong. There were only 2 of them. Ben. I yelled, my voice cracking. Where's Ben? Ellie just pointed, her hand trembling, her face a mask of utter horror. I followed her gaze. Down the slope, at the bottom of the scree field, lay a figure, twisted and unnaturally still. Ben Carter, the most competent man I had ever known, lay broken at the bottom of the ravine, a casualty of a game we never asked to play. And from the dense woods beyond his body, I saw it step into the open. The tall, skeletal figure with the head of a deer and the cold, blue eyes of an ancient, hungry winter. It turned its head, the antlers scraping against a low, hanging branch, and looked directly at us. It wasn't coming for Ben. His part in the game was over. It was coming for us. Time ceased to be a measurable quantity. It became a thick, viscous fluid of pure terror. My memory of the moments after Ben's death is a chaotic slideshow of disconnected images, a narrative fractured by fear. There was the creature, standing over Ben's broken form, not with the frenzy of a predator, but with the calm, proprietary air of an artist admiring his work. The deer skull tilted, the dark antlers like a dead tree against the sky, and the 2 points of blue light, the only color in that gray, desolate landscape, fixed on us. It was not looking at Ben, it was looking at its next course. A sound escaped Ellie's throat, a thin, animal keen of pure despair. That sound broke the spell. We turned and ran, not with any plan or direction, but with the blind, mindless panic of cornered animals. We scrambled back up the scree slope, our lungs burning, our legs screaming in protest. We didn't look back. We didn't need to. We could feel its presence behind us, a cold wave of malevolence that followed us like a shadow. It didn't pursue us immediately. The hunt was a game, and it was a patient player. It let us run, letting the terror build, letting our hope curdle into exhaustion. The forest, which had once been a place of scientific inquiry and natural beauty, became a green hell. Every tree was a potential hiding place for it, every shadow awaiting ambush. We crashed through undergrowth, thorns tearing at our clothes and skin, our breath coming in ragged, painful sobs. "It's the greed," Ellie gasped, stumbling beside me. Her face was pale, streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes held a terrifying, feverish clarity. She was no longer just a historian. She was a prophetess staring into the abyss of her own theories. "Don't you see, Alistair? It's not just a monster in these mountains. It is the mountains. It's the spirit of this place." "What are you talking about?" I yelled, dragging her over a fallen log. "Lulu Citipal. The gold rush. Hundreds of men, driven by insatiable greed, starving for wealth they could never find." Her voice was rising, becoming hysterical. "What is a Wendigo, if not that? The spirit of insatiable hunger, of gluttony that is never satisfied. It grows with every meal, but it's always starving. We came here to study a place of failure, but we didn't understand. The failure didn't just fade away. It festered. It became this thing. It's the psychic echo of their greed, given flesh and bone and antlers." Her words were the ravings of a mind pushed beyond its limits, but they struck me with the force of a physical blow. The neat categories of my world, geology, biology, history, were meaningless here. They were all just facets of the same horrifying truth. We weren't being hunted by a cryptid. We were being hunted by a ghost, the collective, hungry ghost of 100 years of human failure. A sound split the air, shattering our frantic flight. It was the sound of a child crying, a high, pitiful wail that seemed to come from just ahead of us, to the left of the game trail we were blindly following. "No," I whispered, grabbing Ellie's arm. "It's a trick." But the sound was too perfect, too evocative. It bypassed reason and went straight for the heart. Ellie stopped, her head cocked, her expression torn between terror and a deep, ingrained empathy. "Maybe someone's hurt," she said, her voice trembling.
Child! Ali, no! It's the mimicry!
I pleaded, pulling at her, but the crying intensified, turning into a desperate shriek of,
"Mommy."
And then, from the right, we heard a different sound, the heavy, deliberate snapping of a large branch. It was behind us, and it was close. The creature was flanking us, using the phantom cries to drive us, to separate us. In that moment of pure, calculated terror, we broke. Ellie, responding to some deep, maternal instinct twisted by the creature's cruelty, veered left, toward the crying. I screamed her name, but she was gone, swallowed by the dense furs. I made a split-second decision, born of cowardice and the primal urge to live. I kept running straight. I abandoned her. That knowledge is a stone in my gut that I will carry for the rest of my life. I ran, and as I ran, the sound of the crying child abruptly stopped. It was replaced by a single, piercing scream. It was Ellie's voice, and it was a sound of such ultimate, soul-shattering agony that it will echo in my nightmares until the day I die. Then, silence. A silence more profound and terrible than any sound. I don't know how long I ran after that. Hours. A day. My mind was a white, hot blank of terror. I have vague, flashing memories of falling, of crawling, of sobbing in the dirt. I remember the sun setting and the world plunging into a darkness so complete it felt like being buried alive. I spent the night huddled at the base of a rock outcropping, shivering uncontrollably, starting at every whisper of the wind. convinced that the dear, skulled face would appear out of the blackness at any moment. But it never came. The game was over. It had fed. Sometime during the next day, I stumbled out of the forest and onto a trail. A real trail, marked and maintained. A short time later, 2 hikers found me. They saw a man, wild-eyed and babbling, covered in scratches, his clothes in tatters. They saw a victim of exposure and hypothermia, a man whose mind had clearly snapped under the strain of being lost in the wilderness. They gave me water and a granola bar and used their satellite messenger to call for help. A park ranger met us on the trail and escorted me back to the trailhead, back to a world of cars and logic and rules. I tried to tell them. I told them about Ben, about Ellie, about the tracks, the blue mist, the creature. They listened with practiced patience, the kind of gentle condescension one uses for a traumatized child or a madman. The official report is concise and logical. Docker, Eleanor Vance and Ben Carter, lost in an unseasonable blizzard, were likely killed in an avalanche on a steep, unstable slope. My own account was attributed to paranormal-like experiences, brought on by a combination of high altitude, exhaustion, hypothermia, and the psychological trauma of losing my friends. Sense presence. They called it a known neurogenic process. They searched for weeks, but no bodies were ever found. Of course not. There was nothing left to find. I am Dr. Alastair Finch. I was a geologist. I once found comfort in the logic of rock and the vast, rational story of deep time. But that man is gone, buried somewhere in the Rocky Mountains along with my friends. I am now the keeper of a different story. A story of a hungry, malevolent spirit born from the dark heart of human greed. I write this not because I expect to be believed, but because I must. It is the only thing I have left. I am a haunted man, a living ghost of an expedition that went looking for history and found an ancient, waiting hunger. Some nights when the wind howls I can almost hear it, a distorted mimicry of a voice, whispering my name from the distant, blue mountains. The mountains remember, and they are still hungry. My name is Jack, and I am the proprietor of Solitude Peak Cabins. This is not a title of vanity, but a statement of fact, a definition of a role I have occupied for more of my life than I have not. My professional capacity is to provide a curated experience of isolation for those who seek it, and a degree of safety for those who do not understand what they have sought. The property is located deep within the Colorado Rockies, a place where the cartographer's pen strokes become hesitant, then stop altogether. To reach us, you must navigate a single, unpaved road that winds through aspen groves and skirts the edges of chasms for 12 miles past the last sign of civilization. In winter, this road is often a theoretical concept, a memory buried under feet of snow. The cabins themselves, 3 in total, though only one is ever rented to a single party at a time, are sturdy structures of reclaimed timber and native stone, built to withstand the geologic temper of the mountains. They sit in a small, sheltered bowl on the shoulder of the peak, surrounded by a silent congregation of lodgepole pines. From the porch of the main cabin, one can see across the valley to the jagged, indifferent spine of the continent. It is a view of sublime, almost aggressive beauty, the kind of beauty that reminds you of your own insignificance, the fleeting nature of your warmth and your breath. The mountains do not care if you live or die. They were here long before you, and they will remain long after your bones are dust. This is the primary truth of this place, and the sooner a guest understands it, the better. My newest guest, a writer named Alex, arrived today. He drove a sensible all-wheel drive vehicle that was already dusted with the first flakes of the coming storm. He was a man in his late 30s, with the soft hands of a city dweller, and a look in his eyes I recognized well, a mixture of creative desperation and the naive belief that solitude is a gentle muse. He thought he was escaping the noise of his world. He did not yet understand that he was trading it for a silence that is far more demanding. "It's incredible," he said, his breath pluming in the frigid air as he stared at the panorama. "Even more dramatic than the pictures." "The pictures don't capture the scale," I replied, my tone even and professional. "Or the quiet." I helped him with his luggage, a laptop bag and 2 oversized duffels, the typical arsenal of a writer on a deadline. The air was already thick with the promise of a blizzard, the sky a bruised, heavy gray. The wind was beginning to pick up, a low moan that would soon become a shriek. As we stepped inside the main cabin, the sudden warmth and the scent of pine and wood smoke seemed to envelop us, a fragile pocket of domesticity carved out of the immense wilderness. The cabin was well appointed, with a large stone fireplace, comfortable furniture, and a kitchen stocked with basic provisions. A large picture window dominated the main wall, currently framing the swirling snow as a piece of kinetic art. "This is perfect," Alex said, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "Exactly what I needed. No distractions, no neighbors. Just this." "The distractions here are of a different nature," I said, setting his bags down. "Which brings me to the tenancy agreement." From a drawer in the heavy oak desk that sat in the corner, I retrieved a single, laminated card. It was thick, the edges worn smooth from years of use. The text was printed in a simple, clear font under a formal heading. I handed it to him. "This is the guest tenancy and safety addendum," I explained. "It's imperative that you read it and abide by it. The rules are not suggestions. They are conditions of your stay." He took the card, his smile faltering slightly into a look of bemused curiosity. He clearly expected a list of checkout times and Wi-Fi passwords. What he read was something else entirely. "Solitude Peak Cabin's guest tenancy and safety addendum. Welcome to Solitude Peak. For your safety and comfort during your stay, the following rules must be strictly observed. Non-compliance will result in the immediate termination of your tenancy. 1. Curfew of the census. Between the hours of 11 p.m. and 6 a.m., all curtains must be fully drawn and secured. No light should be visible from the outside. Furthermore, no music or audio of any kind should be played at a volume audible beyond the cabin walls during this period. Reason provided, this is to respect the nocturnal patterns of local wildlife and to preserve the natural darkness of the environment from light pollution. 2. The offering. All organic food waste of fruit peels, vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, meat bones, etc. must be collected throughout the day. Before sunset, this waste must be placed within the small, cast iron box located on the back porch. The lid must be secured. Never leave organic waste inside the cabin overnight. Reason provided, this protocol prevents the attraction of bears, mountain lions, and other potentially dangerous scavengers to the immediate vicinity of the cabins. 3. The silence of 3. Should you hear 3 distinct, sharp, and evenly spaced knocks on any door or window, you are to ignore them. Do not answer the door. Do not call out. Do not look through the peephole or part the curtains. Acknowledge the sound in no way. It is the wind. In this part of the mountains, it is always the wind. Reason provided, the unique topography and high altitude pressure systems can create unusual acoustic phenomena that mimic deliberate sounds. Reacting to them is unnecessary. 4. Mirror discipline. After dusk has fallen, you must not gaze at your own reflection in any mirrored surface, a bathroom mirror, window panes, Dark screens for more than 60 seconds at a time. If you must use a mirror, be brief and deliberate. Reason provided. Mild symptoms of altitude sickness can include dizziness and minor visual distortions. Prolonged self-focus in a reflection can exacerbate these feelings and lead to disorientation. 5. The path is absolute. Under no circumstances are you to stray from the clearly marked gravel paths that connect the cabins and lead to the woodshed. This is especially critical after the first significant snowfall, which can obscure treacherous terrain, hidden crevices, and unstable ground. Reason provided. Standard wilderness safety protocol to prevent falls, injury, and becoming lost. Alex finished reading and looked up at me, a quizzical eyebrow raised. The professional smile he had adopted was gone, replaced by a look of genuine puzzlement. He was trying to decide if this was a joke, an elaborate piece of local color for the tourists. "This is very specific," he said, tapping the laminated card with his index finger. "The knocking rule, the mirror thing. You get a lot of nervous city folk up here. I get guests who are unaccustomed to this environment," I replied, my voice betraying no emotion. "The rules are the result of a long and difficult process of learning how to coexist with this place. They are not for my benefit, Mr. Henderson. They are for yours." My formality seemed to disarm his skepticism, at least for a moment. He saw no wink, no hint of a jest in my expression. He saw only a quiet, wary seriousness. He shrugged, placing the card on the mantelpiece of the fireplace. "All right then," he said, forcing a lighter tone. "When in Rome. Curtains closed, trash out, ignore the wind, and no staring contests with myself." "Got it." I gave him a final, curt nod. "I reside in the caretaker's cabin, the one furthest down the path. The generator is reliable, but should it fail, there are lanterns and matches in the kitchen pantry. I will check on you tomorrow morning. Enjoy the quiet." With that, I left him to settle in. As I walked back to my own cabin, the snow was falling in thick, wet flakes, already beginning to cling to my coat. The wind was a living thing in the pines, whispering secrets I had learned long ago not to hear. I did not look back. The first 2 days passed without incident. The storm was relentless, burying the landscape in a deep, sound-dampening blanket of white. The road was impassable. Alex was completely, utterly cut off from the world, just as he'd wanted. I saw the light from his cabin in the evenings, a warm, defiant glow against the vast, encroaching dark. I imagined him at the oak desk, words pouring from his fingertips, fueled by the profound isolation. He was a man in a bottle, and the mountain was the sea. On the third night, the storm broke. The clouds tore themselves apart to reveal a sky of impossible clarity, littered with the cold, sharp diamonds of a billion stars. A full moon, huge and luminous at this altitude, rose over the peaks, bathing the snow-covered world in a sterile, blue, white light. It was a beautiful and therefore dangerous night. Inside his cabin, Alex would have been working. I could picture him, deep in his narrative, the fictional world more real to him than the one outside his window. He would have felt the pull of that moonlight, the desire to see it, to experience the vista he had paid for. The rules, which had likely seemed so strange and arbitrary in the warmth of the cabin, would have felt like foolish superstitions under the spell of that lunar glow. It is the nature of the rational mind to test its boundaries, to push against the illogical. It is a trait that has allowed humanity to build cities and map the stars. Here, it is a fatal flaw. I was banking the fire in my own cabin when I felt it. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a change in the texture of the silence. It was a feeling I had come to know with an intimacy that bordered on dread. A wire had been tripped. A line had been crossed. A small, seemingly insignificant invitation had been extended. Later, much later, Alex would tell me what he did. He had been working late, well past midnight. He'd gotten up to stretch, and through a tiny gap in the curtains of the great picture window, he saw the moonlit landscape. It was, he said, the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He hesitated for only a moment, thinking of my strange list of rules. Then he scoffed at his own timidity. It was just a view. What harm could it do? He pulled one of the heavy curtains back, just a foot or so, leaving a sliver of the world visible. He stood there for a few minutes, mesmerized, before returning to his work, leaving the gap as it was. He noticed nothing at first. The night remained silent, save for the occasional groan of a snow-laden pine branch. He finished his chapter, feeling a surge of creative triumph. He made a cup of tea, the familiar ritual of comfort in the vast emptiness. It was as he was rinsing his mug in the sink that he heard it. 3 sharp, distinct knocks on the window pane directly above the sink. Tap, tap, tap. They were not loud, but they were precise, unmistakable. They were not the random rattling of a branch or the percussive effect of the wind. They were measured, patient, and intelligent. He froze, the mug still in his hand. His heart hammered against his ribs. His first thought, a panicked, primal one, was that I had come to check on him, that I had seen the light in the gapped curtain and was angry. But that made no sense. My cabin was 100 yards away, and the snow was waist deep. And why would I knock on the window like that instead of the door? Then he remembered the rule. It is the wind. It is always the wind. He stood there for a long time, his back to the window, every muscle tensed. He was a rational man, an educated man. He did not believe in ghosts or mountain spirits. It was the wind, a strange acoustic trick, nothing more. He repeated it to himself, a mantra against the fear that was coiling in his stomach. He forced himself to move. He placed the mug in the dish rack, his movements stiff and jerky. He did not turn around. He did not look. He walked out of the kitchen, his eyes fixed straight ahead, and went directly to the picture window. With a trembling hand, he pulled the curtain shut, securing it tightly. He then went around the cabin, checking every other window, ensuring each was completely obscured. Only then did he go to bed, pulling the covers up to his chin like a child. He lay awake for hours, listening to the profound silence, a silence that now felt less like peace and more like a held breath. He had followed the rule, but he knew, with a certainty that defied all logic, that something was now aware of him. The silence was listening. Alex awoke to a world of blinding white and aching silence. Sunlight, sharp and undiluted at this altitude, streamed through a tiny gap he'd missed in the curtains, painting a brilliant stripe across the wooden floor. He had slept, but it was the shallow, fitful sleep of the hunted, leaving him more exhausted than rested. His neck was stiff, his eyes gritty. For a moment, he lay perfectly still, listening. The cabin was quiet. The mountain was quiet. The memory of the 3 sharp taps on the window felt distant, like the fading logic of a dream. He swung his legs out of bed, the cold floorboards shocking him into a more solid reality. He was a writer, he reminded himself as he started the coffee maker. A purveyor of fiction. His mind was his tool, but it was also a notorious liar, prone to exaggeration and flights of fancy. He was isolated, sleep-deprived, and in a strange new environment. Of course, his imagination was running wild. The knocking was the house settling, or a pine cone falling from a branch onto the roof, and the sound echoing strangely. It was a perfectly rational, explainable phenomenon. He felt a wave of relief at this thought, a foolishness for his midnight terror. He was just pouring his first cup of coffee when a heavy knock sounded at the door. This time it was solid, human. Alex jumped, sloshing hot coffee over his hand. Cursing, he ran it under cold water before peering through the peephole. It was me, my figure a dark silhouette against the brilliant snow, my breath a cloud of vapor in the frigid air. He opened the door, forcing a smile that felt brittle. "Morning, Jack." "A Mr. Henderson." I greeted him, my eyes scanning his face. I am sure I noticed the dark circles under his eyes, the slight tremor in his hand. "I trust you had a restful night." The question was innocuous, standard procedure, but to Alex, it felt like an accusation.
Fine, yeah.
Great. The quiet is really something. It takes some getting used to, I said, my gaze drifting past him to the interior of the cabin. The mountain is loudest when it's silent. You learn to listen to what it isn't saying. I gave a curt nod toward the back porch. "Remember to get your offering out before sunset." The forecast says the sky will be clear again tonight. Think things are more active on clear nights. The word things hung in the air between us, undefined and heavy with implication. He wanted to ask, to demand what I meant, but he couldn't bring himself to voice the question. To do so would be to admit that he believed that the terror of the previous night was more than just his imagination. He would be admitting that he was one of those nervous city folk he'd so casually dismissed. "Right, the trash."
Got it?
He mumbled instead. I gave him a final, unreadable look and turned to leave. "Enjoy the words," I said over my shoulder, and then I was gone, my snowshoes leaving a neat, deliberate trail back toward my own cabin. Alex closed the door, his heart pounding again. Things are more active on clear nights. The phrase echoed in his mind, stripping away the rationalizations he had so carefully constructed. My visit had not been reassuring. It had been the opposite. It was a confirmation. I knew what was out here, and my rules were not a quirky welcome packet. They were a shield he had already damaged. He tried to work, but the words wouldn't come. The blank page on his laptop screen seemed to mock him. The silence in the cabin was no longer a peaceful canvas for his thoughts. It was a presence, vast and suffocating. Every creak of the timber, every sigh of the wind in the eaves was a potential threat. He found himself glancing at the laminated card on the mantelpiece again and again, reading the rules until the ink seemed to blur. He was a prisoner to them now. He felt a desperate, clawing need to follow them to the letter. As the day wore on, the sun began its descent, painting the snow outside in hues of orange and pink. The beauty was lost on him. All he could think about was the approaching dusk. He meticulously gathered his organic waste for the day: coffee grounds, an apple core, the rind from a piece of cheese, and placed it in a small bag. The act felt absurd, a primitive ritual, but he performed it with the gravity of a sacrament. He opened the back door. Just as the sun touched the horizon, the air instantly biting at his exposed skin. The cast iron box sat on the porch, squat and black against the snow. He quickly placed the bag inside, the metallic clang of the lid echoing in the twilight stillness. As he secured the latch, he scanned the tree line. The pines stood like silent, hooded figures, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the snow. He thought he saw a flicker of movement deep within the woods, a patch of darkness that seemed to shift and coalesce, but when he blinked, it was gone. He scrambled back inside, bolting the door behind him, his breath coming in ragged bursts. The cabin grew dark quickly. He drew every curtain, checking each one twice to ensure there were no gaps. He ate a joyless meal of canned soup, the silence broken only by the scraping of his spoon against the bowl. He felt a growing paranoia, a sense that the cabin was no longer a sanctuary, but a cage, and he was the bait. Later, he he went into the bathroom to brush his teeth. The face that stared back at him from the mirror was pale and drawn, the eyes wide with a fear he could no longer deny. He remembered the fourth rule: mirror discipline. After dusk has fallen, you must not gaze at your own reflection for more than 60 seconds. He spat the toothpaste into the sink, his eyes still locked on his reflection. Why? What could possibly happen? It was the most ridiculous rule of all. A trick of the mind, that's all it could be. Altitude sickness, just as the card said. He was a rational man. He would prove it to himself. He would look for exactly 61 seconds and nothing would happen. He stared, his heart beginning to thud a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. 10 seconds. His reflection stared back, unblinking. 20 seconds. The fluorescent light above the sink seemed to hum with an unnatural intensity. 30 seconds. Was it a trick of the light, or did the shadows around his eyes seem deeper, darker? 40 seconds. He felt a wave of dizziness, a slight vertigo that made the room seem to tilt. Altitude sickness, he told himself. That's all it is. 50 seconds. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass, and then he saw it. It was infinitesimal, a detail so small he would have missed it if he weren't staring with such desperate intensity. His reflection smiled. It was not his smile. It was a wide, predatory baring of the teeth, a grotesque parody of a human expression that did not touch the eyes. The eyes of his reflection were flat, ancient, and filled with a cold, knowing hunger. The smile lasted for less than a second, a flicker in the glass, but it was there. Alex cried out, stumbling backward, away from the mirror. He tripped over the bath mat and fell, scrambling away on his hands and knees like a terrified animal, his eyes screwed shut. He didn't want to see that face again, that thing wearing his face. He lay on the cold tile of the bathroom floor, hyperventilating, the logical, rational world he had built for himself, shattering into a million pieces. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't his imagination. It wasn't altitude sickness. The rules were real. The danger was real. And something was no longer just knocking on the window. He had looked at it, and it had looked back. It was inside with him now. Terror has a texture. Alex learned this on the cold tile of the bathroom floor. It was smooth and unyielding, like the certainty of his own impending death. He lay there for an unknown amount of time, curled into a fetal position, listening to the frantic drumming of his own heart. The image of that smile was burned onto the backs of his eyelids, a predatory grin that belonged to something ancient and utterly inhuman. He had invited it in, not with a word, but with a look. He had broken the rule, and now the lock was broken, the door unhinged. He eventually forced himself to move, crawling out of the bathroom without looking back, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor. He felt its presence in the cabin now, a static charge in the air, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the fire dying in the hearth. The silence was no longer empty. It was occupied. Every shadow seemed to stretch and writhe in his peripheral vision, and the familiar, comforting creaks of the cabin settling were now the stealthy footsteps of an unseen roommate. He spent the rest of the night huddled in an armchair in the main room, a heavy blanket pulled over his head, facing the fireplace. He did not sleep. He listened. He heard things. A soft, dry scratching sound from the other side of the front door, like a single, long fingernail being dragged slowly across the wood. Later, a whisper, so faint he thought he'd imagined it, seeming to come from the chimney, a sibilant breath that almost sounded like his name. Lex. Daylight, when it finally came, offered no relief. The brilliant sun on the snow was an insult, a mockery of the profound darkness that had taken root inside the cabin and inside him. The world outside was pristine and beautiful, but the cabin had become a contaminated space. He now avoided any surface that could cast a reflection: the darkened screen of his laptop, the black glass of the oven door, even the large picture window that had so captivated him upon his arrival. He covered the bathroom mirror with a towel. He was a man trying to erase himself, to become invisible to the thing that was now hunting him in his own temporary home. He couldn't write. He couldn't eat. He paced the cabin like a caged animal, his mind a frantic loop of fear and regret. The rules. He had to follow the rules. It was the only thing that mattered. His survival depended on it. As dusk began to bleed across the sky, he prepared for the nightly ritual of the offering with the obsessive focus of a bomb disposal expert. He gathered the day's meager scraps, tea leaves, the crust of a piece of bread he'd forced himself to eat, the peel from an orange. He checked and rechecked the small plastic bag, ensuring everything was there. But his mind was fractured, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. While pacing earlier, agitated and restless, he had eaten a pear, and without thinking, had dropped the small, withered core into the pocket of his fleece-lined robe. It was a tiny oversight, a single, forgotten piece of refuse in a cabin filled with his mounting dread. He stepped onto the back porch, the cold air a physical blow. He didn't look at the tree line today. His eyes were fixed on the iron box. He fumbled with the latch, his fingers numb and clumsy, dropped the bag inside, and slammed the heavy lid shut. He secured the latch and practically fell back into the cabin, bolting the door and leaning against it, his chest heaving. He had done it. He had followed the rule. He was safe for another night. He was wrong. An hour after full darkness fell, the scratching at the door began again, but this time it was different. It was louder, more insistent. It wasn't the sound of a single nail, but of many, a frantic, desperate clawing that spoke of a terrible hunger. Alex retreated to his armchair, pulling the blanket tight around him, his eyes wide in the flickering firelight. Then came the whispers. They weren't coming from the chimney anymore. They were inside. A soft, dry rustling sound from the darkest corner of the room, followed by that same sibilant hiss. Ea, Lex hungry. His blood turned to ice. It could speak. He squeezed his eyes shut, his hands over his ears, but the sound was inside his head, a violation of the deepest kind. He began to rock back and forth, muttering the rules to himself like a prayer. Curtains closed. Ignore the knocks. No mirrors. Stay on the path. It was then that his hand, trembling in the pocket of his robe, brushed against something small and hard. He froze. Slowly, with a dawning horror that eclipsed everything he had felt before, he pulled it out. The pear core. He stared at it lying in the palm of his shaking hand. A forgotten scrap. An unpaid tithe. Never leave organic waste inside the cabin overnight. He had failed. The offering was incomplete. The contract was broken. As if in response to his realization, the clawing at the door stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, thick with anticipation. He heard a new sound, a faint, metallic click from the front door. He watched, paralyzed, as the deadbolt, which he had thrown with his own two hands, began to slowly, impossibly, rotate. It turned with a series of agonizingly slow clicks, each one a hammer blow to his sanity. Click, click. The bolt slid free. The doorknob began to turn. That was what broke him. The cabin was not a sanctuary, it was a trap, and the door was about to open. His mind, screaming for an escape, seized on the only option left. Me. He had to get to my cabin. It was his only hope. He scrambled to his feet, his eyes darting to the window. Outside, the moon cast its cold, blue light on a sea of untouched snow. The path, the one absolute, inviolable rule, was completely gone, buried under 4 feet of powder. To reach me, He would have to break the final rule. He would have to leave the path. The choice was no choice at all. A potential death in the snow was better than the certain damnation waiting for him on the other side of the door. He grabbed the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, his only weapon against the unknown. The doorknob stopped turning. A profound silence fell over the cabin, a held breath before the final lunge. He didn't wait to see what would happen next. He ran to the back door, the one he had used for the offering, and fumbled with the bolt. He threw it open and plunged out into the night, the frigid air searing his lungs. He stood on the porch for a second, his eyes adjusting to the stark, monochromatic landscape. And then he saw it. It was standing at the edge of the woods, precisely where the path to my cabin would have been. It was not a man. It was too tall, too thin, its limbs elongated to an unnatural degree, like a tree that had learned to walk. It was a figure of pure blackness, a hole in the moonlit world. It was utterly still, a statue of patient malice. It wasn't trying to get into the cabin anymore. It was waiting for him. It had known he would run. For a single, lucid moment, Alex was caught between two impossibilities. Behind him, the cabin door creaked open, releasing a wave of cold that was not of the mountain, a palpable aura of ancient hunger and decay. Before him, the thing at the tree line stood impossibly still, a silhouette that drank the moonlight and gave nothing back. It was a choice between the teeth in the trap and the teeth in the woods. He chose the woods. He launched himself off the porch, the iron poker held in a white, knuckled grip. The snow was a physical shock, deeper and colder than he could have imagined. It swallowed him to his thighs, each step a desperate, lung-burning struggle. He was a city man, soft and unprepared, and the mountain was an indifferent killer. He glanced over his shoulder. The tall, dark figure had not moved, but he felt its attention on him, a cold pressure against the back of his neck. He pushed forward, his only thought to reach the distant, faint light of my cabin. This was the final rule, the one he had been warned against breaking under any circumstances. The path is absolute. The laminated card had provided a rational reason: treacherous terrain, hidden crevices. The reality was infinitely worse. The path was not just a cleared trail. It was an agreement, a line of truce, and he had just stepped over it. He had gone maybe 50 yards when the figure began to move. It did not run. It did not walk. It seemed to glide over the surface of the snow, its unnatural limbs carrying it with a fluid, horrifying grace. It was not hindered by the deep powder that was slowly killing him. It belonged here. He did not. Panic gave him a surge of adrenaline. He flailed through the snow, his breath sobbing in his throat. The cold was a living entity, seeping through his clothes, stealing the warmth from his blood, the strength from his muscles. His mind, starved of oxygen and flooded with terror, began to fracture. The whispering started again, no longer from the cabin, but from the sighing pines all around him. The snow-laden branches took on the shapes of grasping, skeletal hands. The pristine, moonlit beauty of the landscape became a monstrous canvas of shifting shadows and imagined threats. He stumbled, his foot catching on something buried beneath the snow. He fell hard, his face plunging into the icy powder. The iron poker flew from his numb fingers, disappearing into the white. He tried to push himself up, but his limbs were heavy, unresponsive. Hypothermia was setting in, a slow, insidious death. He rolled onto his back, gasping, his heart hammering a frantic, failing rhythm. The figure was closer now, looming over him. It was only 20 feet away, and for the first time, he could see it was not just a shadow. It had a form, a texture like charred bark, and a shape that was a blasphemous mockery of the human frame. It had no face, only a smooth, dark expanse where features should have been. It raised one of its long, spindly arms, and the air grew colder still. It was then that a new light appeared. A steady, golden glow, cutting through the sterile blue of the moonlight. It came from my cabin. I was walking toward them, holding an old, brass-paned lantern. The light it cast was warm, alive. The figure stopped. It turned its featureless head toward me, a gesture of pure curiosity. It seemed to shrink away from the lantern's glow, a subtle recoil, as if the warmth were anathema to it. I did not run. I walked with a steady, deliberate pace, my snowshoes crunching on the crust of the snow. I stopped a few yards from Alex, placing myself between him and the creature. I said nothing. I simply held the lantern aloft. Inside, it was not a simple flame, but a piece of glowing, amber-colored resin, emitting a faint, aromatic smoke. The creature stood its ground for a long moment, a standoff in the silent, frozen theater of the mountains. Then, with a movement so slow it was almost imperceptible, it lowered its arm. It gave one last, long look at the shivering man half buried in the snow, then turned and dissolved back into the deep shadows of the pines, leaving no tracks. I lowered the lantern and looked down at Alex. His eyes were wide with a terror that had burned past screaming. His lips were blue. "You broke the rules," I said. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. I hauled him to his feet and half dragged, half carried him back to my cabin. It was small, Spartan, smelling of wood smoke, pine resin, and something else, a dry herbal scent. I sat him in a chair by the crackling stove, wrapped him in heavy wool blankets, and forced a mug of hot, bitter tea into his trembling hands. He drank it mechanically, his eyes still fixed on the darkness outside the window. He was silent for a long time, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the chattering of his own teeth. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raw whisper. What was that?" I stoked the fire, my back to him. "It has no name that you would understand. It is the mountain, or a part of it, the oldest part. The rules," he stammered. "The laminated card. The reasons on the card are for people like you," I said, turning to face him. "Plausible lies to make the impossible seem manageable. The real reasons are more complicated." I picked up my own worn copy of the rules from my mantelpiece. Rule 1, the curfew of the senses. It's not about respecting wildlife. It's about not being seen. The night belongs to it. When you look out into its world, you issue an invitation for it to look into yours. "The knocks," he breathed. Rule 3, the silence of 3. The wind doesn't knock. That is a question it asks. Are you alone? May I enter? By ignoring it, you refuse the invitation. But you had already opened the curtain. You had already let it see you. The mirror. Rule 4, mirror discipline. Reflections are like water, still surfaces. It can move through them. When you stared, you held a door open for it. You saw it smile because it was already on the other side, looking back at you. He shuddered violently, pulling the blanket tighter. The offering. The pure core I forgot. Rule 2, the offering. That is the most important rule. It is not a suggestion to prevent scavengers. It is a tithe, a payment, acknowledgement of its sovereignty here. You are a guest in its house, and you must pay rent. You came up short. It came to collect. Alex stared into the fire, his face a mask of dawning, soul-crushing comprehension. And the path, I left the path. "Yes," I said, my voice low. Rule 5, the path is absolute. The path is a truce, a line drawn in the snow. On it, you are a visitor, and you are tolerated, so long as the other rules are followed. The moment you stepped off it, you were no longer a visitor. You were a trespasser. And it does not suffer trespassers gladly. We sat in silence for the rest of the night. 2 days later, the sun had worked on the snow enough that I could clear the road with my plow. Alex packed his bags in a numb, silent haste. The man who left was not the man who had arrived. The desperate writer seeking inspiration was gone, replaced by a haunted man who had looked into an abyss and found something looking back. His eyes were old, and he flinched at shadows. His novel would never be finished. I watched his sensible all-wheel-drive vehicle disappear down the winding road, the last trace of him erased by the indifferent landscape. I walked back to the main cabin. It was cold and silent, holding no memory of the terror that had unfolded within its walls. I cleaned it meticulously, changing the linens, sweeping the floors, and wiping down every surface. From the heavy oak desk, I took out a fresh, laminated card. I placed it in the center of the desk, ready for the next guest. Outside, the sun shone on the magnificent, snow-covered peaks. The mountains were beautiful, they were silent, and they were waiting. My name is Samuel Ulrich. I am 34 years old, and until 3 months ago, I was a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in Winnipeg. This is a statement of fact, not a complaint. The termination was, in their words, a structural realignment. My performance was never in question. The fact remains, however, that my position was eliminated, and with it, my salary, my benefits, and my pension contributions. This event coincided with 2 others of significant financial impact. First, the final notice of foreclosure on the 2-bedroom bungalow my family and I inhabited. Second, the diagnosis of our daughter, Lily, with a severe respiratory condition requiring specialized, ongoing treatment not fully covered by the provincial health plan. These are the variables of the equation that led me here. The problem was simple and immediate and severe deficit, with liabilities far exceeding liquid assets. The solution needed to be drastic. For weeks, the solution remained elusive. I submitted over 200 job applications. I received 7 automated rejections and 1 interview for a commission-only sales position for which I was wholly unsuited. The savings dwindled. The letters from creditors became more frequent, their language less courteous. My wife, Sarah, took on extra shifts at the diner, coming home exhausted, her smiles growing thinner. The weight of it all was a physical presence in our small house, a pressure in the air that made it hard to breathe. It was during a late-night session of scrolling through obscure job boards, the kind that feel like the internet's forgotten back alleys, that I found it. The advertisement was stark, almost primitive in its design. Piosatiuevele, night manager, caretaker, locatiopol. Boreal Gateway Motel, Northern Manitoba, remota duties, overnight supervision, light maintenance, guest services. Arqui menacin, self-reliance, ability to follow instructions precisely. Compensiert 80,000 month, cash. Accommodation provided, starty immediate. The salary was absurd. It was more than double what I had made as an accountant. It was enough to stop the foreclosure, pay for Lily's treatments, and build a buffer. It was a lifeline. It was also, by every rational measure, too good to be true. There was no company name, just a simple email address. I sent a message detailing my situation with a frankness born of pure desperation. I didn't embellish or lie. I simply laid out the facts of my need. The reply came less than an hour later. The position is yours. A key and instructions will be waiting for you at the front desk. Come alone. Sarah and I argued. It was the worst fight we'd ever had. She saw the danger, the glaring red flags that I was deliberately ignoring. Sam, this is crazy, she pleaded, her voice cracking. A cash job in the middle of nowhere. No interview. Who does that? I couldn't give her a good answer, because there wasn't one. All I had was the cold arithmetic of our ruin. "It's for 1 month, Sarah," I said, my voice hollow. "Just 1 month, 30 days. It will fix everything." In the end, she relented, not because she was convinced, but because she saw the desperation in my eyes and knew there was no other path. I packed a single duffel bag, kissed my sleeping daughter goodbye, and drove north as the sun began to stain the eastern sky. The journey north is a process of subtraction. You leave the city, and the world begins to peel away in layers. First the suburbs, then the sprawling farms of the prairies. The highway narrows from 4 lanes to 2. The towns become smaller, farther apart. The landscape transforms, the flat plains giving way to the rugged Precambrian shield, a realm of rock, muskeg, and water. South of the pass, the pavement gave out, turning into a wide, well-maintained gravel road that still sent shudders through the frame of my old sedan. The cell phone lost its last bar of signal with a sad little chime, the "no service" icon appearing like a tombstone on the screen. It was a profound and unsettling silence. I was untethered, a ship cut loose from its moorings. The gas stations became a source of mounting anxiety. They were small, independent operations, often little more than a single pump attached to a general store, and the gaps between them stretched for over 100 kilometers. I stopped at the last one, a place called Trapper's Rest, and filled the tank and a spare 5-gallon can in the trunk. The man behind the counter was old, his face a roadmap of wrinkles. He looked at my car, my clean city clothes, and the direction I was headed. "You going far?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "Boreal Gateway Motel," I said. He just nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "Watch yourself out there. The north. It has its own ways." For the last 2 hours of the drive, I saw no other cars. The forest pressed in on both sides of the road, a dense, dark wall of black spruce and tamarack. The sky was a vast, empty canvas of pale blue, and the sheer scale of it made me feel infinitesimally small. This wasn't just empty land, it was a presence. It felt ancient and indifferent, an environment that existed long before man and would exist long after. It was the first antagonist, a silent force that isolates you, stripping away your confidence with every passing kilometer. I found the motel just as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. A simple wooden sign, Bioriel Guao Maudiel, pointed down a short side road. The motel itself was a single-story building, a long, low rectangle with 6 numbered doors and an office at one end. It was starkly functional, painted a dull forest green, but it was also impeccably clean. There were no weeds in the gravel lot, no peeling paint, no flickering lights. It was unnervingly tidy for a place so remote. The office door was unlocked. I stepped inside, and the air was cool and smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old paper. It was empty. A polished wooden counter ran the length of the small room, and on it sat a single brass key and a neatly folded sheet of white paper. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. The text was typewritten, crisp and black. "Welcome to the Boreal Gateway Motel. My name was Elias. The money will be wired to your account weekly, as promised. Your duties are simple: stay awake and follow the rules. Follow them to the letter. Do not question them. Do not try to find clever ways around them. Your survival depends on it." Beneath the brief, wary introduction was the list. 1. The generator must be checked at 9 p.m., 12 a.m., and 3 a.m. Do not miss a check. The fuel costs are high, but the alternative is higher. 2. Keep the front and back doors locked after sundown. This is not for people. 3. You will hear knocking at odd hours. If it is a pattern of 3, answer it. If it is any other number, or has no rhythm, ignore it. Do not look through the peephole. 4. We only have 6 rooms. If you see a light on in room 7, unplug the main switchboard in the office for exactly 1 minute, then plug it back in. Do not investigate room 7. 5. A woman may call the front desk asking for her husband. Tell her he is not here and hang up. Do not engage her in conversation, no matter what she offers you. Her voice can be very persuasive. 6. Between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m., do not look directly at the sky, especially if the northern lights are active. They are not dancing for you. 7. Sometimes, a guest will check in. He is a tall, thin man in a dark suit, even in summer. He will not have luggage. Give him the key to room 3 and take his cash payment. Do not make eye contact. He is a welcome guest. 8. Sometimes, a guest will check in who is not the man from Rule 7. They are not welcome. Follow the instructions on the emergency sheet under the desk. 9. If you smell wet soil and decaying leaves inside the office, open the back door and leave it open until the smell is gone, no matter how cold it is. 10. Do not eat the food left in the staff refrigerator. It is not for you. I read the list 3 times. My hands were shaking. This had to be a joke. Some elaborate sick prank played on desperate people. Room 7. There were only 6 rooms. A woman on the phone. A tall man in a suit. It was the stuff of cheap ghost stories, the kind of thing you read on the internet late at night. I almost laughed. I should have turned around, gotten back in my car, and driven the 8 hours back to Winnipeg with my tail between my legs. But I couldn't. The image of the foreclosure notice, of Lily's small, struggling breaths, of Sarah's exhausted face. It was all there, holding me in place. I was a man standing on a burning platform, and this was the only rope that had been thrown to me, no matter how frayed it looked. I took a deep breath, the pine-scented air doing nothing to calm the frantic hammering in my chest. I would stay. I would follow the rules. It was just a job. The sun disappeared completely, and a profound darkness fell over the landscape, a blackness so complete it seemed to swallow sound itself. The only light came from the single bulb in the office and the faint hum of the generator out back. I walked around the small space, my footsteps echoing loudly. I checked the lock on the front door. It was a heavy deadbolt. I found the back door, leading to a small, cleared area behind the motel, and locked that one too. Rule 2. Done. I sat behind the desk. The list spread out before me like a map to a hostile country. The minutes crawled by. The silence was the worst part. It was a living thing, pressing in from all sides. At exactly 9 p.m., my watch alarm beeped, making me jump. Rule 1. I grabbed a heavy flashlight from a drawer and went out the back door, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The generator was in a small shed, chugging away steadily. I checked the fuel gauge. It was full. The mundane task felt absurdly ritualistic, a small pocket of normalcy in a growing sea of dread. I returned to the office and waited. 10:17 p.m. it happened. A sound from the front door. Scrabble, scratch, thump, thump. It wasn't a pattern. It was a rhythmic, frantic, like a panicked animal. Rule 3. Ignore it. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to look through the peephole, to shout, to do something. I froze, my hands gripping the edge of the desk, so hard my knuckles turned white. I stared at the door, my breath held tight in my chest. The scratching continued for another minute, then stopped as abruptly as it had begun. Silence rushed back in to fill the void. I didn't move for a long time. At 11:42 p.m., the old rotary phone on the desk rang, its shrill blaring cutting through the silence like a knife. I stared at it, my mind racing. Rule 5. I picked up the receiver, my hands slick with sweat. "Hello," I whispered. A voice answered, a woman's voice. impossibly sweet and clear, like wind chimes. Hello. I was told my husband might be there. I've been looking for him for so long. My blood ran cold. I didn't let her finish. He is not here, I said, my voice a choked rasp, and slammed the phone back into its cradle. I slumped into the chair, breathing heavily. It was real. All of it. The list wasn't a prank. It was a manual, a survival guide. I looked at the clock on the wall. It wasn't even midnight. I had the entire night ahead of me, a long, dark road paved with impossible rules, and the terrifying certainty that breaking them would have consequences. I smoothed the paper on the desk, my fingers tracing the typewritten letters. This list was my new religion, and I was its sole, terrified disciple. The first sliver of dawn was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. It wasn't a glorious sunrise, just a gradual dilution of the oppressive, absolute blackness into a bruised, gray twilight. But it was enough. It meant I had made it. The night was over. I had survived. Exhaustion hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't slept, hadn't even dozed. Every nerve had been stretched taut for 8 solid hours. As the sun climbed higher, casting long, distorted shadows from the spruce trees, the motel seemed to transform. In the clean light of day, it was just a building again. The gravel lot was just gravel. The 6 doors were just doors. The fear of the night seemed absurd, a fever dream brought on by isolation and an overactive imagination. But I knew it wasn't. The memory of the scratching, of that impossibly sweet voice on the phone, was burned into my mind. I checked my bank account on the office's ancient, dial-up connected computer. $2,000 had been deposited. The first weekly payment. Seeing the numbers on the screen, stark and real, solidified my resolve. This was a transaction, my sanity for my family's survival. I would make that trade. I spent the day in a haze, performing the mundane tasks of a caretaker. I swept the office, restocked the small rack of tourist pamphlets, all for places hundreds of kilometers away, and checked the inventory of cleaning supplies. My movements were slow, automatic. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the events of the night, poring over the list of rules. It was my scripture now, my only guide in this desolate parish. My exploration of the office yielded a new discovery. Taped to the underside of the heavy wooden desk, I found another sheet of paper, this one sealed in a yellowed plastic sleeve. It was the emergency sheet mentioned in Rule 8. My fingers trembled as I peeled it free. Einstier Seftaus fo RUNWLCOM US 1. Do not accept any payment they offer. It is not for you and it is not real. 2. Give them the key to room 6. Do not speak to them beyond what is necessary. 3. As soon as they are inside room 6 and the door is closed, go to the breaker box in the back storage room. Flip the breaker marked 6. 4. Do not turn the breaker back on until sunrise. You will hear noises from the room. Pay them no mind. The sounds are not real. 5. At sunrise, turn the breaker back on. The room will be empty. Clean it as you would any other room. You may find personal items left behind. Burn them. Do not keep them. I read it, and a cold dread, separate from the frantic terror of the night, settled deep in my bones. This was different. The other rules were about avoidance, about ignoring things or performing small, strange rituals. This was an action, a procedure, a trap. I was not just a gatekeeper. I was an executioner of some kind. The thought made me physically ill. I taped the sheet back under the desk, the plastic cool and slick against my clammy fingers. As dusk began to fall again, the familiar anxiety returned, coiling in my stomach. The forest seemed to reclaim the land, the shadows deepening, the silence pressing in. I locked the doors, the heavy click of the deadbolts sounding like the closing of a tomb. I sat behind the desk, the list of rules laid out beside me, a cup of instant coffee growing cold in my hands. I was a sentry, waiting for a siege I knew was coming. The first few hours were quiet, deceptively so. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the hum of the generator and the frantic beating of my own heart. I performed the 9 p.m. generator check, the beam of my flashlight cutting a nervous path through the darkness. Everything was normal. At 12:47 a.m., it began. A smell. It wasn't sudden, but a gradual creeping thing. It was the scent of a freshly dug grave of rich, wet soil and the sweet, cloying odor of decaying leaves. It was impossible. I was in a sealed, clean office, yet the smell was as real as the wooden desk beneath my hands. Rule 9. If you smell wet soil and decaying leaves inside the office, open the back door and leave it open until the smell is gone, no matter how cold it is. The temperature outside had plummeted. It couldn't have been more than a few degrees above freezing. Opening the door was madness. But the alternative, the implied consequence of disobeying, was worse. I stood, my legs unsteady, and walked to the back door. I unlocked it and pulled it open. A wave of frigid air washed over me, stealing my breath. The smell of decay was instantly stronger, rushing in from the blackness outside. I retreated to the desk, wrapping my arms around myself, my teeth chattering uncontrollably. The cold was brutal, seeping into my bones. I stared at the open doorway, a perfect rectangle of night, expecting something to step through it at any moment. But nothing came. For 20 agonizing minutes, I sat there, shivering, until, as gradually as it had arrived, the earthy, rotten smell faded, replaced by the clean, sharp scent of pine and cold air. I hurried to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it, my body shaking from both cold and relief. I was trying to coax some warmth back into my fingers when I saw it. A light, a soft, yellow light emanating from the window of the last room on the right. Room 7. My blood turned to ice. I counted the doors again, my eyes tracing the numbers painted on them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There were only 6 doors. There was no room 7, yet I could see it. A 7th door, identical to the others, and a window beside it, glowing with a warm, inviting light. It was a physical impossibility, a violation of the basic laws of space and reality, and it was happening right in front of me. Rule 4. If you see a light on in room 7, unplug the main switchboard in the office for exactly 1 minute, then plug it back in. Do not investigate room 7. My breath hitched. The switchboard was an old-fashioned affair on the wall behind the counter, a tangle of thick black cables leading to a single, large plug in a heavy-duty socket. My watch had a second hand. I could time it precisely. I stood, my gaze fixed on the impossible light outside. It seemed to pulse gently, a silent invitation. Do not investigate. I reached for the plug. It was heavy and warm to the touch. With a grunt of effort, I pulled it from the wall. The office was plunged into absolute darkness. The hum of the generator was the only sound, the only link to a world that made sense. I stood in the blackness, my eyes wide, counting the seconds in my head. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000. It was the longest minute of my life. The silence in the office felt different now, heavier. I was acutely aware of my own breathing, my own heartbeat. At exactly 60 seconds, I fumbled for the plug and shoved it back into the socket. The lights flickered back on. I rushed to the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. The 7th door was gone. The light was gone. There were only 6 rooms again, dark and silent under the vast, star-dusted sky. It was as if it had never been there. But I had the afterimage of it burned onto my retinas, a ghost of impossible architecture. It was almost 3 a.m. when the headlights appeared, sweeping across the front of the motel. A car crunched to a halt on the gravel. My body went rigid. A guest. My eyes darted to the rules. Rule 7 or Rule 8. My fate for the next hour depended on who stepped out of that car. The car door opened, and a figure emerged. A man. He was tall and unnaturally thin, his form a sharp silhouette against the darkness. He wore a dark, old-fashioned suit, despite the chill in the air. He carried no luggage. Rule 7. He is a welcome guest. A wave of relief, so profound it almost made me dizzy, washed over me. The front door of the office opened, and the man stepped inside. He moved with a stiff, deliberate grace, his shoes making no sound on the linoleum floor. Up close, he was even more unsettling. His face was pale and gaunt, his features sharp and angular, but it was his eyes that were the most unnerving. They were dark, empty voids, and they were fixed on a point on the wall just over my shoulder. He never once looked at me. "A room," he said. His voice was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "Of course," I managed, my own voice a reedy whisper. I fumbled for the key to room 3, my hand shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I placed it on the counter. "That will be $60. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a small, worn leather wallet. From it, he produced 3 crisp $20 bills and laid them on the counter. His fingers were long and white, like bleached bone. Rule 7. Do not make eye contact. I kept my eyes glued to the countertop, to his skeletal fingers, to the money. I could feel his empty gaze on my face, a cold, heavy pressure. It took every ounce of my willpower not to look up. He picked up the key, turned without another word, and walked out of the office. I watched through the window as he unlocked the door to room 3 and disappeared inside. The light in the room did not turn on. I waited until I was sure he was settled before I reached for the money. The bills were cold, colder than the night air, and felt strangely stiff, like old parchment. I put them in the cash register, my movements jerky. The rest of the night passed in a blur of terrified silence. I did the 3 a.m. generator check, my eyes scanning the darkness for any other movement. I obeyed Rule 6, keeping my gaze firmly on the ground. Even as the sky began to shimmer with the faint, ethereal green of the aurora borealis. The Cree might see dancing spirits, but I only saw a warning. When the gray light of dawn finally returned, I felt a profound shift inside me. I had survived another night. I had followed the rules. I had faced the impossible light of room 7 and entertained the man in the suit. I was no longer just a desperate man trying to save his family. I was becoming part of the motel's ecosystem, a cog in its terrifying, nocturnal machine. And as I prepared the coffee for the welcome guest in room 3, I had the sickening realization that I didn't know how to leave anymore. Not just because of the money, but because I was now a keeper of secrets that had no place in the sunlit world. The sun rose on my 3rd day at the Boreal Gateway Motel, and with it came a fragile, temporary sanity. The man in the dark suit was gone. I had cautiously checked room 3 after seeing his old car missing from the lot, my hand hovering over the doorknob for a full minute before I dared to turn it. The room was pristine. The bed was made with military precision. The single towel in the bathroom was folded and dry, and the cold, stiff money I'd taken from him was the only evidence he had ever been there. There was no trace of a human presence, no warmth, no lingering scent. It was as if a ghost had paid for a night's lodging. I spent the daylight hours in a state of hyper-vigilance. The fear didn't recede with the darkness anymore. It had sunk deeper into my marrow. I was a prisoner on a 24-hour watch, except the prison was also my duty station. I found myself obsessively cleaning, scrubbing already spotless surfaces, rearranging the tourist pamphlets, anything to keep my hands busy and my mind from spiraling. I tried to call Sarah, using the office's crackling landline, but the call wouldn't connect, dying with a series of clicks and a flat, dead tone. The isolation was no longer just a geographic fact. It was a physical barrier, as real and impassable as a wall of stone. My only connection to the world I was trying to save was the photograph in my wallet. It was worn at the edges. A picture of Sarah and Lily at a park in Winnipeg. They were laughing, their faces bright with a simple, uncomplicated joy that felt like it belonged to another lifetime. Looking at it was a form of self-inflicted torture. I was doing this for them, but the person in the photo, the smiling husband and father, was being eroded with every passing hour, replaced by a hollow-eyed creature who flinched at shadows and spoke to no one. The stakes were deeply personal, but in saving their lives, I was losing my own. As evening approached, I steeled myself. The routine was becoming grimly familiar. Lock the doors, make the coffee I would barely touch, lay out the list of rules like a priest preparing for Mass. The sun set, and the immense, crushing silence of the northern wilderness descended once more. At 9:38 p.m., a new sound broke the silence. A knock on the front door. It wasn't the frantic, animalistic scratching from the first night. This was deliberate, measured. Knock. Knock. A perfect pattern of 3. My breath caught in my throat. Rule 3. If it is a pattern of 3, answer it. The second part of the rule. The part I hadn't had to follow yet. The instruction to ignore the other sounds implied that they were hostile. What did that make this? An invitation. A summons. I stood, my legs feeling like lead. I walked to the door, my hand trembling as it reached for the deadbolt. I didn't look through the peephole. The rule was clear on that. I took a shaky breath, turned the lock, and pulled the door open just wide enough to see. There was no one there. The gravel lot was empty, bathed in the cold, pale light of the moon. But on the doorstep, placed neatly in the center of the welcome mat, was a small, rectangular object wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. It looked like a small parcel. I hesitated, my mind screaming at me to slam the door and lock it. But I had answered. The transaction, whatever it was in progress. I quickly bent down, snatched the package, and retreated back into the office, locking the door behind me. I sat at the desk, staring at the object. It was heavier than it looked. My fingers fumbled with the twine. Inside the paper was a small, leather-bound book, its cover blank and worn smooth with age. I opened it. The pages were filled with neat, spidery handwriting. It wasn't a diary or a novel. It was a ledger. Dates, names, and cryptic notes filled the pages. June 12, 1978, our apprentice unwelcome. Room 6, item, child shoe. October 3, 1984, the Miller family, unwelcome. Room 6, item family photograph, July 23, 1995, J. Harker, welcome. Room 3, payment rendered. On and on it went, a meticulous, horrifying record of the motel's true business. The last entry was dated 2 nights ago. Samuel Auric, night manager, accepted. And below that, a single, fresh entry in the same spidery hand. The tall man, welcome. Room 3, payment rendered. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a job. It was a position, a title passed down. Elias, the man from the introductory note, must have been my predecessor. Was his name in this book? I flipped towards the beginning. There it was. Elias Thorne, night manager, accepted. This book was the motel's true history, a chronicle of its keepers and its victims. And now, it was mine. I was part of the ledger. I was still reeling from the discovery when the headlights cut across the window. A battered pickup truck, at least 20 years old, rattled into the lot and parked crookedly. My stomach clenched. I shoved the ledger into the desk drawer and focused on the door, my heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm. A young couple got out. They couldn't have been much older than 20. The boy was tall and lanky, with a worried look on his face. The girl was small, wrapped in a thin jacket, shivering in the cold night air. They looked like kids. Lost, scared kids. They hurried to the office door and stepped inside, bringing a gust of cold air with them. "Excuse me," the boy said, his voice cracking slightly. "Our truck, it just died on us. We saw your light. Do you have a room? Just for the night. We don't have much cash, but we have a credit card." I stared at them, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. Rule 8. Sometimes, a guest will check in who is not the man from Rule 7. They are not welcome. Under the desk, the emergency sheet felt like it was burning a hole through the wood. I'm sorry, our machine is down. Cash only, I heard myself say. My voice sounded distant foreign. The girl's face fell. "Oh, we only have about $40. That's fine," I said, the words tasting like ash. "The room is 40. They looked at each other, a wave of relief passing between them.
Oh, thank you!
"Thank you so much," the girl said, her smile genuine and bright. It was the brightest, most human thing I had seen in days, and it felt like a physical blow. My hands moved on their own, my body following a script I didn't want to read. I pulled out the key for room 6. I took their crumpled bills. I avoided their eyes, focusing on the counter, on the key, on anything but their hopeful, trusting faces. "It's the second to last door on the left," I said, my voice a monotone. "Have a good night." They thanked me again, their gratitude like knives in my gut, and walked out. I watched them through the window as they found the room and let themselves in. A light flickered on inside. Now came the procedure. The emergency sheet. As soon as they are inside room 6 and the door is closed, go to the breaker box in the back storage room. Flip the breaker marked 6. I couldn't move. I was frozen in my chair. The couple's smiling faces burned into my mind. They were just kids. Lost. Their truck broke down. This was a real-world problem, a mundane inconvenience, and I was about to turn it into a nightmare. But what was the alternative? What happened if I didn't follow the rule? The list was absolute. The consequences were unimaginable. I thought of Lily, of her small, trusting face. I was making a deal, trading the souls of these strangers for the life of my daughter. With a strangled sob, I pushed myself up from the chair and walked on trembling legs to the storage room. The breaker box was on the wall, a cold, gray metal rectangle. My eyes found the switch marked with a faded number 6. My hand was shaking violently. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool plastic. I closed my eyes. "I'm sorry." I flipped the switch. The effect was instantaneous. From outside, a single, piercing scream cut through the night, followed by a sickening wet crunch. Then, a different sound. A low, guttural tearing, punctuated by frantic, muffled pleading. Rule 4 of the emergency sheet: you will hear noises from the room. Pay them no mind. The sounds are not real, but they were real. They were the most real thing I had ever heard. I stumbled back into the office and collapsed into the chair, pressing my hands over my ears, but it was useless. The sounds bored directly into my skull. I could hear furniture splintering, the boy's voice shouting in defiance, and then choking off, the girl's screams dissolving into a high, thin whimper, and beneath it all, a sound of something feeding. It went on for what felt like an eternity. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was heavier, more profound than any that had come before. It was a dead silence, filled with the echoes of what I had just done. I didn't move until the first gray light of dawn touched the sky. I was hollowed out, a shell of a man. I walked back to the breaker box and with a dead, mechanical motion, flipped the switch back on. Rule 50 at sunrise. Turn the breaker back on. The room will be empty. Clean it as you would any other room. You may find personal items left behind. Burn them. Do not keep them. I took the cleaning cart, my movements stiff and robotic, and walked to room 6. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open. The room was immaculate. The beds were made. The floor was clean. It was as if no one had ever been inside, except for one thing. Sitting in the very center of the perfectly made bed was a small, worn teddy bear. I stared at it, and something inside me broke. I picked it up. It was soft, well, loved. I thought of Lily's own collection of stuffed animals, lined up on her bed at home. I walked out of the room, leaving the cleaning cart behind. I went to the incinerator barrel behind the motel, the one I used for trash. I dropped the bear inside, doused it with lighter fluid, and threw in a match. As the flames consumed the small, plush figure, I received a notification on my phone. Another $2,000 had been deposited into my account. I looked from the burning bear to the balance on the screen. The price had been paid, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to my soul, that I would pay it again. The days bled into one another, marked only by the rising and setting of a sun I no longer felt brought warmth or hope. The man I had been, Samuel Alric, accountant, husband, father, was a ghost, a faint echo in the back of my mind. His worries about mortgages and medical bills seemed quaint, the problems of a world that no longer existed. My world was the motel. Its rules were my reality, its schedule my heartbeat. I stopped trying to call home. The dead silence on the line was a more honest answer than any lie I could have concocted. What would I have said? "Hello, Sarah. I'm doing well. I had to sacrifice a police officer last night to a thing that lives in the walls. But the good news is that Lily's next treatment is paid for." The absurdity of it was a black, bitter humor that I was beginning to acquire. The ledger became my Bible and my burden. I spent the daylight hours poring over its spidery script, tracing the lineage of names and fates. There were dozens of unwelcome guests, each entry a tombstone marking a life extinguished for the motel's maintenance. Their items: a wedding ring, a driver's license, a single baby shoe, were the currency of this place. The welcome guests were fewer, their entries stark and cold. The tall man was a recurring figure, a constant in the motel's bloody arithmetic. I was a bookkeeper again, but my ledgers no longer tracked dollars and cents. They tracked souls. My curiosity, bludgeoned by fear, began to fester into a kind of morbid obsession. Rule 10, the one I had so far managed to ignore, gnawed at me. Do not eat the food left in the staff refrigerator. It is not for you. During the long, silent hours of my 4th day, I finally succumbed. I walked to the small, humming refrigerator in the corner of the office. My hand hesitated on the handle, a final tremor of my old self warning me to stop. I ignored it. I opened the door. The cold air that washed over me was thick with the coppery smell of old blood. It wasn't filled with food. It was filled with neatly wrapped butcher, paper parcels, each tied with twine and labeled with a date. I recognized the date on the topmost package. It was from 2 nights ago, the night the young couple had arrived. Beside the parcels were several glass jars filled with a dark, viscous liquid that seemed to absorb the light. This wasn't a refrigerator. It was a pantry, and I was the one stocking it. I slammed the door shut, a wave of nausea washing over me. The food wasn't for me. It was for the motel. or for whatever lived inside it. The nights were a blur of ritual and terror. The generator checks, the rhythmic knocking that delivered artifacts of the damned, the sweet, voiced woman on the phone who now whispered my daughter's name before I could slam the receiver down. I was becoming numb to it, the horror calcifying into a grim routine. I was a part of the mechanism. On the fifth night, the headlights that swept across the lot belonged to a vehicle I had been dreading. A police cruiser. My body went cold and still. An officer, a man named Jim Langston according to his name tag, stepped out. He looked tired, his face etched with the weariness of long hours on lonely roads. He walked into the office, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "Evening," he said, his voice professional but tired. "I'm investigating a missing persons report. A young couple, truck broke down somewhere on this road a few nights back. Haven't been seen or heard from since. You see anyone like that?" He held up a flyer. On it were the smiling, hopeful faces of the two kids I had sent into room 6. My mind raced. This man was not the guest from Rule 7. He was, by the motel's brutal logic, unwelcome. The emergency instructions were clear. The rules were absolute. To break them was to invite a consequence far worse than anything this officer could do to me. My choice was no choice at all. I was merely an instrument of this place. "I haven't seen them, officer," I said, my voice steady. It shocked me how easy the lie was. "But you look like you've had a long night. The roads are rough out here. Why don't you take a room for the night? On the house. Get some rest before you head back out in the morning." He looked surprised, then grateful. "Well, I might just take you up on that. Thank you." My hands didn't shake as I took the key for room 6 from the hook. I placed it on the counter. "It's the second to last on the left. Sleep well, officer." He nodded, took the key, and left. I watched him walk to the room, his footsteps crunching on the gravel. He unlocked the door and went inside. A light came on. I didn't hesitate. I walked to the back room, to the cold gray breaker box. I looked at the switch marked 6. This was my job now. This was the price. For Sarah. For Lily. I flipped the switch. The sounds that came from the room were horrific, a symphony of terror I was becoming all too familiar with. A man's surprised shout, the sharp crack of a gunshot, then a scream of agony that was cut short by the same wet, tearing sound. The static of his radio crackled for a moment, a voice calling his name, and then there was only the sound of feeding. I went back to the desk, sat down, and waited for the dawn. The sounds were not real, I told myself, but they were the only real thing in my world. When the sun finally rose, I flipped the breaker back on. I took my cleaning cart and went to room 6. It was empty, spotless. On the center of the bed lay the officer's missing persons flyer. I picked it up, folded it neatly, and put it in my pocket. I walked back to the office. The first wire transfer had been for $2,000. After the couple, another $2,000 had appeared. I checked my account. My balance had increased by $4,000. The price for an officer of the law was apparently higher. The transaction was complete. I sat at the desk and pulled the heavy ledger towards me. I opened it to a fresh page. The pen felt cool and familiar in my hand. I made my entry, my own handwriting neat and precise, a perfect mimicry of the script that filled the book. Officer Jim Langston. Unwelcome. Room 6, item missing person flyer. I closed the book. The sun was fully up now, casting a pale, sterile light across the empty gravel lot. I looked at my reflection in the dark office window. The man staring back was a stranger. His eyes were old, his face a mask of cold resolve. The fear was gone, burned away, and replaced by something else. acceptance. I was no longer Samuel Auric, the man from Winnipeg who had taken a job out of desperation. That man was a missing person, another ghost haunting this stretch of road. I was the night manager. I was the keeper of the rooms and the recorder of the debts. This was not a temporary post. It was a life sentence.